Chapter 19 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, A Plan Frustrated. The road curled like a paper ribbon round the shoulder of a hill and dropped into a shallow valley. To the left, a little below the level of the road, a stream ran swiftly through a narrow meadow of lush green grass. Beyond the meadow, the wall of the valley rose rough, with outcroppings of rock, and with every tuft of its herbage already brown from the sun. On the right, the northern wall rose almost from the road's edge. The valley was long and curved slowly, and halfway along, to the point where it disappeared, a secondary road, the sort of road which is indicated in the motorist handbook by a dotted line, branched off to the left, crossed the stream by a stone bridge, and vanished in a cleft of the southern wall. Beyond this branching road grew trees. The stream disappeared under them as though it ran into a cavern. The slopes on either side were hidden behind trees so thick that here, at this end, the valley looked bare in the strong sunlight, but low trees as if they had determined to harmonize with their environment. Indeed, the whole valley had a sort of doll's house effect. It was so shallow and narrow and stunted. It tried to be a valley, and succeeded in being a depression. When the little two-seater car swooped round the shoulder of the hill and descended, the white ribbon of road was empty but for one tiny speck at the far end, behind which a stream of dust spurted and spread like smoke from the runnel of an engine. "That motor dust is going to smother us when we pass," said Jim. "We shall do as much for him," said Betty, looking over her shoulder from the steering wheel. "No worse." Behind the car the dust was a screen. "But I don't mind, do you, Jim?" she asked with a laugh, at which, for the first time, with a heart of thankfulness, Jim heard a note of gaiety. To be free of that town, if only for an hour! Oh! And Betty opened her lungs to the sunlight and the air. "This is my first hour of liberty for a week." Frobisher was glad, too, to be out upon the slopes of the Côte d'Or. The city of Dijon was ringing that morning with the murder of Jean Claudel. You could not pass down a street but you heard his name mentioned, and some sarcasms about the police. He wished to forget that nightmare of a visit to the street of Gambetta and the dreadful twisted figure on the floor of the back room. "You'll be leaving it for good very soon, Betty," he said significantly. Betty made a little grimace at him and laid her hand upon his sleeve. "Jim," she said, and the color rose into her face and the car swerved across the road. "You mustn't speak like that to the girl at the wheel," she said, with a laugh, as she switched the car back into its course, "or I shall run down the motorcyclist and that young lady in the sidecar." "The young lady," said Jim, "happens to be a portmanteau." The motorcyclist, indeed, was slowing down as he came nearer to the branching road, like a tourist unacquainted with the country, and when he actually reached it, he stopped altogether and dismounted. Betty brought her car to a standstill beside him and glanced at the clock and the speedometer in front of her. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man standing beside the motorcycle was a young man, slim, dark, and of a pleasant countenance. He took off his helmet and bowed politely. "Madame, I'm looking for Dijon," he said, in a harsh accent, which struck Frobisher as somehow familiar to his ears. "Monsieur, you can see the tip of it through that gap across the valley," Betty returned. In the very center of the cleft, the point of the soaring spire of the cathedral stood up like a delicate lance. "But I warn you that that way, though short, is not good." Through the gradually thinning cloud of dust which hung behind the car, they heard the jug-jug of another motorcycle. "The road by which we have come is the better one," she continued. "But how far is it?" the young man asked. Betty once more consulted her speedometer. 40 kilometers, and we have covered them in 40 minutes, so that you can see the going is good. We started at 11 punctually, and it is now 20 minutes to 12. "Surely we started before 11, Jim interposed. "Yes, but we stopped for a minute or two to tighten the strap of the toolbox on the edge of the town, and we started from there at 11. The motorcyclist consulted his wrist watch. Yes, it's 20 minutes to 12 now, he said, but 40 kilometers. I doubt if I have the essence. I think I must try the nearer road. The second motorcycle came out of the dust like a boat out of a sea mist and slowed down in turn at the sight of them. The rider jumped out of his saddle, pushed his goggles up on his forehead, and joined in the conversation. That little road, monsieur, it is not one of the national highways. That shows itself at a glance. But it is not so bad. From the stone bridge, one can be at the Hôtel de Ville of Dijon in 25 minutes. Oh, I thank you, said the young man. You will pardon me. I have been here for 7 minutes, and I am expected. He replaced his helmet, mounted his machine, and with a splutter and half a dozen explosions, ran down into the bed of the valley. The second cyclist readjusted his goggles. Will you go first, madame, he suggested. Otherwise I give you my dust. Thank you, said Betty with a smile, and she slipped in the clutch and started. Beyond the little forest and the curve, the ground rose and the valley flattened out. Across their road, a broad highway set with kilometer stones ran north and south. The road to Paris, said Betty, as she stopped the car in front of a little inn with a tangled garden at the angle. She looked along the road Paris-wards. Air, she said, and drew a breath of longing, whilst her eyes kindled and her white, strong teeth clicked as though she was biting a sweet fruit. Soon, Betty, said Jim, very soon. Betty drove the car into a little yard at the side of the river. We will lunch here in the garden, she said, all amongst the earwigs and the roses. An omelette, a cutlet perfectly cooked and piping hot, with a salad and a bottle of Clos de Prince of the 1904 vintage, brought the glowing city of Paris immeasurably nearer to them. They sat in the open under the shade of a tall hedge. They had the tangled garden to themselves. They laughed and made merry in the golden May, and visions of wonder trembled and opened before Jim Frobisher's eyes. Betty swept them away, however, when he had lit a cigar and she a cigarette, and their coffee steamed from the little cups in front of them. Let us be practical, Jim, she said. I want to talk to you. The sparkle of gaiety had left her face. Yes, he asked. About Anne. Her eyes swept round and rested on Jim's face. She ought to go. Run away? Cried Jim with a start. Yes, at once, and as secretly as possible. Jim turned the proposal over in his mind while Betty waited in suspense. It could not be managed, he objected. It could. Even if it could, would she consent? She does. Of course, it's pleading guilty, he said slowly. Oh, it isn't, Jim. She wants time, that's all. Time for my necklace to be traced, time for the murderer of Jean Claudel to be discovered. You remember what I told you about Hanaud? He must have his victim. You wouldn't believe me, but it's true. He's got to go back to Paris and say, you see, they sent from Dijon for me, and 5 minutes. That's all I needed. 5 little minutes, and there's your murderess, all tied up and safe. He tried to fix it on me first. No. He did, Jim. And now that has failed, he has turned on Anne. She'll have to go. Since he can't get me, he'll take my friend. Yes, and manufacture the evidence into the bargain. Betty, Hanaud wouldn't do that, Frobisher protested. But, Jim, he has done it, she said. When? When he put that Edinburgh man's book about the arrow poison back upon the bookshelf in the library. Jim was utterly taken aback. Did you know that he had done that? I couldn't help knowing, she answered. The moment he took the book down, it was clear to me. He knew it from end to end, as if it was a primer. He could put his finger on the plates, on the history of my uncle's arrow, on the effect of the poison, on the solution that could be made of it in an instant. He pretended that he had learned all that in the half-hour he waited for us. It wasn't possible. He had found that book the afternoon before, somewhere, and had taken it away with him secretly, and sat up half the night over it. That's what he had done. Jim Frobisher was sunk in confusion. He had been guessing first this person, then that, and in the end had had to be told the truth, whereas Betty had reached it in a flash by using her wits. He felt that he had been just 1 minute and a half in the bull ring. Betty added in a hot scorn, "Then, when he had learnt it all up by heart, he puts it back secretly in the bookshelf and accuses us." "But he admits he put it back," said Jim slowly. Betty was startled. "When did he admit it?" "Last night, to me," replied Jim, and Betty laughed bitterly. She would hear no good of Hanaud. "Yes, now that he has something better to go upon." "Something better?" "The disappearance of my necklace. Oh, Jim, Anne has got to go. If she could get to England, they couldn't bring her back, could they? They haven't evidence enough. It's only suspicion, and suspicion, and suspicion. But here in France, it's different, isn't it? They can hold people on suspicion, keep them shut up by themselves, and question them again and again. Oh, yesterday afternoon in the hall, don't you remember, Jim? I thought Hanaud was going to arrest her there and then." Jim Frobisher nodded. "I thought so, too." He had been a little shocked by Betty's proposal, but the more familiar he became with it, the more it appealed to him. There was an overpowering argument in its favor of which neither he nor Hanaud had told Betty a word. The shaft of the arrow had been discovered in Anne Upcott's room, and the dart in the house of Jean Claudel. These were overpowering facts. On the whole, it was better that Anne should go, now, whilst there was still time, if, that is, Hanaud did undoubtedly believe her to be guilty. "But it is evident that he does," cried Betty. Jim answered slowly, "I suppose he does. We can make sure, anyway. I had a doubt last night, so I asked him point blank." "And he answered you?" Betty asked with a gasp. "Yes and no. He gave me the strangest answer." "What did he say?" "He told me to visit the church of Notre Dame. If I did, I should read upon the façade whether Anne was innocent or not." Slowly, every tinge of color ebbed out of Betty's face. Her eyes stared at him, horror-stricken. She sat, a figure of ice, except for her eyes, which blazed. "That's terrible," she said with a low voice, and again, "That's terrible." Then, with a cry, she stood erect. "You shall see. Come." And she ran towards the motor car. The sunlit day was spoiled for both of them. Betty drove homewards, bending over the wheel, her eyes fixed ahead. But Frobisher wondered whether she saw anything at all of that white road which the car devoured. Once, as they dropped from the highland and the forest to the plains, she said, "We shall abide by what we see?" "Yes." "If Hanaud thinks her innocent, she should stay. If he thinks her guilty, she must go." "Yes," said Frobisher. Betty guided the car through the streets of the city and into a wide square. A great church of the Renaissance type, with octagonal cupolas upon its two towers, and another little cupola surmounted by a loggia above its porch, confronted them. Betty stopped the car and led Frobisher into the porch. Above the door was a great bas-relief of the Last Judgment, God amongst the clouds, angels blowing trumpets, and the damned rising from their graves to undergo their torments. Both Betty and Frobisher gazed at the representation for a while in silence. To Frobisher it was a cruel and brutal piece of work, which well matched Hanaud's revelation of his true belief. "Yes, the message is easy to read," he said, and they drove back in a melancholy silence to the Maison Grenelle. The chauffeur, Georges, came forward from the garage to take charge of the car. Betty ran inside the house and waited for Jim Frobisher to join her. "I am so sorry," she said in a broken voice. "I kept a hope somewhere that we were all mistaken. I mean, as to the danger Anne was in. I don't believe for a moment in her guilt, of course, but she must go. That's clear." She went slowly up the stairs, and Jim saw no more of her until dinner was served long after its usual hour. And Upcott he had not seen at all that day, nor did he even see her then. Betty came to him in the library a few minutes before 9. "We are very late, I am afraid. There are just the two of us, Jim," she said with a smile, and she led the way into the dining room. Through the meal she was anxious and preoccupied, nodding her assent to anything that he said, with her thoughts far away and answering him at random, or not answering him at all. She was listening, Frobisher fancied, for some sound in the hall, an expected sound which was overdue. For her eyes went continually to the clock, and a flurry and agitation, very strange in one naturally so still, became more and more evident in her manner. At length, just before 10 o'clock, they both heard the horn of a motor-car in the quiet street. The car stopped, as it seemed to Frobisher, just outside the gates, and upon that there followed the sound for which Betty had so anxiously been listening, the closing of a heavy door by someone careful to close it quietly. Betty shot a quick glance at Jim Frobisher and colored when he intercepted it. A few seconds afterwards the car moved on, and Betty drew a long breath. Jim Frobisher leaned forward to Betty. Though they were alone in the room, he spoke in a low voice of surprise. "And Upcott has gone, then?" "Yes." "So soon? You had everything already arranged, then?" "It was all arranged yesterday evening. She should be in Paris tomorrow morning, England tomorrow night, if only all goes well." Even in the stress of her anxiety, Betty had been sensitive to a tiny note of discontent in Jim Frobisher's questions. He had been left out of the counsels of the two girls. Their arrangements had been made without his participation. He had only been told of them at the last minute, just as if he was a babbler not to be trusted, and an incompetent whose advice would only have been a waste of time. Betty made her excuses. "It would have been better, of course, if we had got you to help us, Jim, but Anne wouldn't have it. She insisted that you had come out here on my account, and that you mustn't be dragged into such an affair as her flight and escape at all. She made it a condition, so I had to give way. But you can help me now tremendously." Jim was appeased. Betty, at all event, had wanted him, was still alarmed lest their plan undertaken without his advice might miscarry. "How can I help?" "You can go to the cinema and keep Monsieur Hanaud engaged. It's important that he should know nothing about Anne's flight until late tomorrow." Jim laughed at the futility of Hanaud's devices to hide himself. It was obviously all over the town that he spent his evenings in the Grand Taverna. "Yes, I'll go," he returned. "I'll go now." But Hanaud was not that night in his accustomed place, and Jim sat there alone until 10:30. Then a man strolled out from one of the billiard rooms, and standing behind Jim, with his eyes upon the screen, said in a whisper, "Do not look at me, monsieur. It is Moreau. I go outside. Will you please to follow?" He strolled away. Jim gave him a couple of minutes' grace. He had remembered Hanaud's advice and had paid for his bock when it had been brought to him. The little saucer was turned upside down to show that he owed nothing. When 2 minutes had elapsed, he sauntered out, and, looking neither to the right nor to the left, strolled indolently along the Rue de la Gare. When he reached the Place d'Arcy, Nicolas Moreau passed him without a sign of recognition, and struck off to the right along the Rue de la Liberté. Frobisher followed him with a sinking heart. It was folly, of course, to imagine that Hanaud could be so easily eluded. No doubt that motor-car had been stopped. No doubt Anne Upcott was already under lock and key. Why, the last words he had heard Hanaud speak were, "I must be quick." Moreau turned off into the Boulevard Sévigné, and, doubling back to the Station Square, slipped into one of the small hotels which cluster in that quarter. The lobby was empty. A staircase, narrow and steep, led from it to the upper stories. Moreau now ascended it with Frobisher at his heels, and opened a door. Frobisher looked into a small and dingy sitting-room at the back of the house. The windows were open, but the shutters were closed. A single pendant in the center of the room gave it light, and at a table under the pendant Hanaud sat, poring over a map. The map was marked with red ink in a curious way. A sort of hoop, very much the shape of a tennis racket without its handle, was described upon it, and from the butt to the top of the hoop an irregular line was drawn, separating the hoop roughly into two semicircles. Moreau left Jim Frobisher standing there, and in a moment or two Hanaud looked up. "Did you know, my friend," he asked very gravely, "that Anne Upcott has gone tonight to Madame Levet's fancy dress ball?" Frobisher was taken completely by surprise. "Oh, I see that you didn't," Hanaud went on. He took up his pen and placed a red spot at the edge of the hoop, close by the butt. Jim recovered from his surprise. Madame Levail's ball was the spot from which the start was to be made. The plan, after all, was not so ill devised, if only Anne could have got to the ball unnoticed. Masked and in fancy dress, amongst a throng of people similarly accoutred, in a house with a garden, no doubt thrown open upon this hot night, and lit only by lanterns discreetly dim, she had thus her best chance of escape. But the chance was already lost, for Hanaud laid down his pen again and said in ominous tones, "The water-lily, eh? That pretty water-lily, my friend, will not dance very gaily tonight." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, A Map and the Necklace. Hanaud turned his map round and pushed it across the table to Jim Frobisher. "What do you make of that?" he asked, and Jim drew up a chair and sat down to examine it. He made, first of all, a large-scale map of Dijon and its environments, the town itself lying at the bottom of the red hoop, and constituting the top of the handle of the tennis racket. As to the red circle, it seemed to represent a tour which someone had made out from Dijon, round a good tract of outlying country, and back again to the city. But there was more to it than that. The wavy dividing line, for instance, from the top of the circle to the handle, that is, to Dijon, and on the left-hand edge of the hoop, as he bent over the map, and just outside Dijon, the red mark, a little red square, which Hanaud had just made. Against this square an hour was marked. 11 a.m., he read. He followed the red curve with his eyes, and just where this dividing line touched the rim of the hoop, another period was inscribed. Here Frobisher read 11:40. Frobisher looked up at Hanaud in astonishment. "Good God!" he exclaimed, and he bent again over the map. The point where the dividing line branched off was in a valley, as he could see by the contours. Yes, he had found the name now, the Val d'Aison. Just before 11 o'clock, Betty had stopped the car just outside Dijon, opposite a park with a big house standing back, and had asked him to tighten the strap of the toolbox. They had started again exactly at 11. Betty had taken note of the exact time, and they had stopped where the secondary road branched off and doubled back to Dijon at the top of the hoop, at the junction of the rim and the dividing line, exactly at 11:40. "This is a chart of the expedition we made today," he cried. "We were followed then." He remembered suddenly the second motorcyclist who had come up from behind through the screen of their dust and had stopped by the side of their car to join in their conversation with the tourist. "The motorcyclist?" he asked, and again he got no answer. But the motorcyclist had not followed them all the way round. On their homeward course they had stopped to lunch in the tangled garden. There had been no sign of the man. Jim looked at the map again. He followed the red line from the junction of the two roads round the curve of the valley to the angle where the great national road to Paris cut across and where they had lunched. After luncheon they had continued along the national road into Dijon, whereas the red line crossed it and came back by a longer and obviously a less frequented route. "I can't imagine why you had us followed this morning, Monsieur Hanaud," he exclaimed with some heat. "But I can tell you this, the chase was not very efficiently contrived. We didn't come home that way at all." "I haven't an idea how you came home," Hanaud answered imperturbably. "The line on that side of the circle has nothing to do with you at all, as you can see for yourself by looking at the time marked where the line begins." The red hoop at the bottom was not complete. There was a space where the spliced handle of the racket would fit in, the space filled by the town of Dijon, and at the point on the right-hand side where the line started, Frobisher read in small but quite clear figures, 10:25 a.m. Jim was more bewildered than ever. "I don't understand one word of it," he cried. Hanaud reached over and touched the point with the tip of his pen. "This is where the motorcyclist started, the cyclist who met you at the branch road at 11:40. "The tourist?" asked Jim. A second ago it had seemed to him impossible that the fog could thicken about his wits any more, and yet it had. "Let us say the man with the portmanteau on his trailer," Hanaud corrected. "You see that he left his starting point in Dijon 35 minutes before you left yours. The whole maneuver seems to have been admirably planned, for you met precisely at the arranged spot at 11:40. Neither the car nor the cycle had to wait one moment." "Maneuver? Arranged spot?" Frobisher exclaimed, looking about him in a sort of despair. "Has everyone gone crazy? Why in the world should a man start out with a portmanteau in a sidecar from Dijon at 10:25, run 30 or 40 miles into the country by a roundabout road, and then return by a bad straight track? There's no sense in it." "No doubt it is perplexing," Hanaud agreed. He nodded to Moreau, who went out of the room by a communicating door towards the front of the house. "But I can help you," Hanaud continued. "At the point where you started after tightening the strap of the toolbox on the edge of the town, a big country house stands back in a park." "Yes," said Jim. "That is the house of Madame Levay, where this fancy-dress ball takes place tonight." "Madame Levay's chateau?" Frobisher repeated. "Where—" He began a question and caught it back, but Hanaud completed it for him. "Yes, where Anne Upcott now is. You started from it at precisely 11 in the morning." He looked at his watch. "It is not yet 11 at night, so she is still there." Frobisher started back in his chair. Hanaud's words were like the blade of silver light cutting through the darkness of the cinema hall and breaking into a sheet of radiance upon the screen. The meaning of the red diagram upon Hanaud's map, the unsuspected motive of Betty's expedition this morning, were revealed to him. "It was a rehearsal!" he cried. Hanaud nodded. "A time rehearsal." "Yes, the sort of thing which takes place in theaters, without the principal members of the company," thought Frobisher, but a moment later he was dissatisfied with that explanation. "Wait a moment," he said. "That won't do, I fancy." The motorcyclist with the sidecar had brought his argument to a standstill. His times were marked upon the map. They were therefore of importance. What had he to do with Anne Upcott's escape? But he visualized the motorcyclist and his sidecar, and his connection with the affair became evident. The big portmanteau gave Frobisher the clue. Anne Upcott would be leaving Madame Levay's house in her ball dress, just as if she was returning to the Maison Grenelle, and without any luggage at all. She could not arrive in Paris in the morning like that if she were to avoid probably suspicion and certainly remark. The motorcyclist was to meet her at the Val d'Isson, transfer her luggage rapidly to her car, and then return to Dijon by the straight, quick road, whilst Anne turned off at the end of the valley to Paris. He remembered now that 7 minutes had elapsed between the meeting of the cycle and the motor car and their separation. 7 minutes, then, were allowed for the transference of the luggage. Another argument flashed into his thoughts. Betty had told him nothing of this plan. It had been presented to him as a mere excursion on the summer day, her first hours of liberty naturally employed. Her silence was all of a piece with the determination of Betty and Anne Upcott to keep him altogether out of the conspiracy. Every detail fitted like the blocks in a picture puzzle. Yes, there had been a time rehearsal, and Hanaud knew all about it. That was the disturbing certainty which first overwhelmed Frobisher when he had got the better of his surprise at the scheme itself. Hanaud knew, and Betty had so set her heart on Anne's escape. "Let her go," he pleaded earnestly. "Let Anne Upcott get away to Paris and to England." And Hanaud leaned back in his chair with a little gasp. The queerest smile broke over his face. "I see," he said. "Oh, I know," Frobisher exclaimed, hotly appealing. "You are of the Sûreté, and I am a lawyer, an officer of the High Court in my country, and I have no right to make such a petition. But I do, without a scruple. You can't get a conviction against Anne Upcott. You haven't a chance of it. But you can throw such a net of suspicion about her that she'll never get out of it. You can ruin her, yes, but that's all you can do." "You speak very eagerly, my friend," Hanaud interposed. Jim could not explain that it was Betty's anxiety to save her friend which inspired his idea. He fell back upon the scandal which such a trial would cause. "There has been enough publicity already owing to Boris Wabersky," he continued. "Surely Miss Harlowe has had distress enough. Why must she stand in the witness box and give evidence against her friend in a trial which can have no result? That's what I want you to realize, Monsieur Hanaud. I have had some experience of criminal trials. Oh, shade of Mr. Hazlitt! Why was that punctilious man not there in the flesh to wipe out with an indignant word the slur upon the firm of Frobisher and Hazlitt? And I assure you that no jury could convict upon such evidence. Why, even the pearl necklace has not been traced, and it never will be. You can take that from me, Monsieur Hanaud. It never will be." Hanaud opened a drawer in the table and took out one of those little cedar-wood boxes made to hold 100 cigarettes, which the better class of manufacturers use in England for their wares. He pushed this across the table towards Jim. Something which was more substantial than cigarettes rattled inside of it. Jim seized upon it in a panic. He had not a doubt that Betty would far sooner lose her necklace altogether than that her friend, Anne Upcott, should be destroyed by it. He opened the lid of the box. It was filled with cotton wool. From the cotton wool he took a string of pearls, perfectly graded in size and gleaming softly with a pink luster which even to his untutored eyes was indescribably lovely. "It would have been more correct if I had found them in a matchbox," said Hanaud, "but I shall point out to Monsieur Bex that, after all, matches and cigarettes are akin." Jim was still staring at the necklace in utter disappointment when Moreau knocked upon the other side of the communicating door. Hanaud looked again at his watch. "Yes, it is 11 o'clock. We must go. The car has started from the house of Madame Lavey." He rose from his chair, buried the necklace again within the layers of cotton wool, and locked it up once more in the drawer. The room had faded away from Jim Frobisher's eyes. He was looking at a big, brilliantly illuminated house, and a girl who slipped from a window and, wrapping a dark cloak about her glistening dress, ran down the dark avenue in her dancing slippers to where a car waited hidden under trees. "The car may not have started," Jim said with sudden hopefulness. "There may have been an accident to it. The chauffeur may be late. Oh, 100 things may have happened." "With a scheme so carefully devised, so meticulously rehearsed?" "No, my friend." Hanaud took an automatic pistol from a cabinet against the wall and placed it in his pocket. "You are going to leave that necklace just like that in a table drawer?" Jim asked. "We ought to take it first to the Prefecture." "This room is not unwatched," replied Hanaud. "It will be safe." Jim hopefully tried another line of argument. "We shall be too late now to intercept Anne Upcott at the branch road," he argued. "It is past 11, as you say, well past 11, and 35 minutes on a motorcycle in the daytime means 50 minutes in a car at night, especially with a bad road to travel." "We don't intend to intercept Anne Upcott at the branch road," Hanaud returned. He folded up the map and put it aside upon the mantel-shelf. "I take a big risk, you know," he said softly, "but I must take it. And no, I cannot be wrong." But he turned from the mantel-shelf with a very anxious and troubled face. Then, as he looked at Jim, a fresh idea came into his mind. "By the way," he said, "the Façade of Notre Dame?" Jim nodded. "The bas-relief of the Last Judgment. We went to see it. We thought your way of saying what you believed a little brutal." Hanaud remained silent with his eyes upon the floor for a few seconds, and then he said quietly, "I am sorry." He tacked on a question. "You say 'we'?" "Mademoiselle Harlowe and I," Jim explained. "Oh, yes, to be sure. I should have thought of that." And once more his troubled cry broke from him. "It must be that. No, I can't be wrong. Anyway, it's too late to change now." A second time Moreau rapped upon the communicating door. Hanaud sprang to alertness. "That's it," he said. "Take your hat and stick, Monsieur Frobisher. Good. You are ready?" And the room was at once plunged into darkness. Hanaud opened the communicating door, and they passed into the front room, a bedroom looking out upon the big station square. This room was in darkness, too, but the shutters were not closed, and there were patches of light upon the walls from the lamps in the square, and the Grand Taverna in the corner. The three men could see one another, and to Jim, in this dusk, the faces of his companions appeared of a ghastly pallor. "Daunet took his position when I first knocked," said Moreau. "Patenot has just joined him." He pointed across the square to the station buildings. Some cabs were waiting for the Paris train, and in front of them 2 men dressed like artisans were talking. One of them lit a cigarette from the stump of a cigarette held out to him by his companion. The watchers in the room saw the end of the cigarette glow red. "The way is clear, monsieur," said Moreau. "We can go." And he turned and went out of the inn to the staircase. Jim started to follow him. Whither they were going, Jim had not a notion, not even a conjecture. But he was gravely troubled. All his hopes and Betty's hopes for the swift and complete suppression of the Waberski affair had seemingly fallen to the ground. He was not reassured when Hanaud's hand was laid on his arm and detained him. "You understand, Monsieur Frobisher," said Hanaud with a quiet authority, his eyes shining very steadily in the darkness, his face glimmering very white, "that now the law of France takes charge. There must not be a finger raised or a word spoken to hinder officers upon their duty. On the other hand, I make you in return the promise you desire. No one shall be arrested on suspicion. Your own eyes shall bear me out." The 2 men followed Moreau down the stairs into the street. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21, The Secret House. It was a dark, clear night, the air very still and warm, and the sky bright with innumerable stars. The small company penetrated into the town by the back ways and narrow alleys. Daunet going on ahead, Patenot the last by some 30 yards, and Moreau keeping on the opposite side of the street. Once they had left behind them the lights of the station square, they walked amongst the closed doors and the blind faces of unlit houses. Frobisher's heart raced within his bosom. He strained his eyes and ears for some evidence of spies upon their heels, but no one was concealed in any porch, and not the stealthiest sound of a pursuit was borne to their hearing. "On a night like this," he said in tones which, strive as he might to steady them, were still a little tremulous, "one could hear a footstep on the stones 1/4 of a mile away, and we hear nothing. Yet if there is a gang, it can hardly be that we are unwatched." Hanaud disagreed. "This is a night for alibis," he returned, lowering his voice. "Good, sound, incontestable alibis. All but those engaged will be publicly with their friends, and those engaged do not know how near we are to their secrets." They turned into a narrow street, and kept on its left-hand side. "Do you know where we are?" Hanaud asked. "No, yet we are near to the Maison Grenelle. On the other side of these houses, to our left, runs the street of Charles Robert." Jim Frobisher stopped dead. "It was here, then, that you came last night, after I left you at the Préfecture," he exclaimed. "Ah, you recognized me, then?" Hanaud returned imperturbably. "I wondered whether you did when you turned at the gates of your house." On the opposite side of the street, the houses were broken by a high wall, in which 2 great wooden doors were set. Behind the wall, at the end of a courtyard, the upper story and the roof of a considerable house rose in a steep ridge against the stars. Hanaud pointed towards it. "Look at that house, monsieur. There Madame Raviat came to live while she waited to be set free. It belongs to the Maison Grenelle. After she married Simon Harlowe, they would never let it. They kept it just as it was, the shrine of their passion, that strange, romantic couple. But there was more romance in that, to be sure. It has been unoccupied ever since." Jim Frobisher felt a chill close about his heart. Was that house the goal to which Hanaud was leading him with so confident a step? He looked at the gates and the house. Even in the night it had a look of long neglect and decay, the paint peeling from the doors and not a light in any window. Someone in the street, however, was awake, for just above their heads a window was raised with the utmost caution, and a whisper floated down to them. "No one has appeared." Hanaud took no open notice of the whisper. He did not pause in his walk, but he said to Frobisher, "And, as you hear, it is still unoccupied." At the end of the street, Daunet melted away altogether. Hanaud and Frobisher crossed the road, and with Moreau just ahead, turned down a passage between the houses to the right. Beyond the passage, they turned again to the right into a narrow lane between high walls, and when they had covered 30 yards or so, Frobisher saw the branches of leafy trees over the wall upon his right. It was so dark here under the shade of the boughs that Frobisher could not even see his companions, and he knocked against Moreau before he understood that they had come to the end of their journey. They were behind the garden of the house in which Madame Raviat had lived and loved. Hanaud's hand tightened upon Jim Frobisher's arm, constraining him to absolute immobility. Bâtonnot had vanished as completely and noiselessly as Daunet. The three men left stood in the darkness and listened. A sentence which Anne Upcott had spoken in the garden of the Maison Grenelle, when she had been describing the terror with which she had felt the face bending over her in the darkness, came back to him. He had thought it false then. He took back his criticism now, for he too imagined that the beating of his heart must wake all Dijon. They stood there motionless for the space of a minute, and then, at a touch from Hanaud, Nicolas Moreau stooped. Frobisher heard the palm of his hand sliding over wood, and immediately after the tiniest little click as a key was fitted into a lock and turned. A door in the wall swung silently open and let a glimmer of light into the lane. The three men passed into the garden of weeds and rank grass and overgrown bushes. Moreau closed and locked the door behind them. As he locked the door, the clocks of the city struck the half-hour. Hanaud whispered in Frobisher's ear, "They have not yet reached the Valtaison. Come." They crept over the mat of grass and weeds to the back of the house. A short flight of stone steps, patched with mold, descended from a terrace. At the back of the terrace were shuttered windows, but in the corner of the house, on a level with the garden, there was a door. Once more Moreau stooped, and once more a door swung inwards without a sound. But whereas the garden door had let through some gleam of twilight, this door opened upon the blackness of the pit. Jim Frobisher shrank back from it, not in physical fear, but in an appalling dread that some other man than he, wearing his clothes and his flesh, would come out of that door again. His heart came to a standstill, and then Hanaud pushed him gently into the passage. The door was closed behind them. An almost inaudible sound told him that now the door was locked. "Listen," Hanaud whispered sharply. His trained ear had caught a sound in the house above them, and in a second Frobisher heard it too, a sound regular and continuous and very slight, but in that uninhabited house, filled with uttermost blackness, very daunting. Gradually the explanation dawned upon him. "It's a clock ticking," he said under his breath. "Yes, a clock ticking away in the empty house," returned Hanaud, and though his answer was rather breathed than whispered, there was a queer thrill in it, the sound of which Jim could not mistake. The hunter had picked up his spoor. Just beyond, the quarry would come in view. Suddenly a thread of light gleamed along the passage, lit up a short flight of stairs, and a door on the right at the head of them, and went out again. Hanaud slipped his electric torch back into his pocket, and, passing Moreau, took the lead. The door at the head of the stairs opened with a startling whine of its hinges. Frobisher stopped with his heart in his throat, though what he feared he could not have told even himself. Again the thread of light shone, and this time it explored. The three found themselves in a stone-flagged hall. Hanaud crossed it, extinguished his torch, and opened the door. A broken shutter swinging upon a hinge enabled them dimly to see a gallery which stretched away into the gloom. The faint light penetrating from the window showed them a high double door leading to some room at the back of the house. Hanaud stole over the boards and laid his ear to the panel. In a little while he was satisfied. His hand dropped to the knob, and a leaf of the door opened noiselessly. Once more the torch glowed. Its beam played upon the high ceiling, the tall windows shrouded in heavy curtains of red silk brocade, and revealed to Frobisher's amazement a room which had a look of daily use. All was orderly and clean, the furniture polished and in good repair. There were fresh flowers in the vases, whose perfume filled the air, and it was upon the marble chimney-piece of this room that the clock ticked. The room was furnished with lightness and elegance, except for one fine and massive press, with double doors in marquetry, which occupied a recess near to the fireplace. Girandoles with mirrors and gilt frames, now fitted with electric lights, were fixed upon the walls, with a few pictures in watercolor. A chandelier glittering with lustres hung from the ceiling. An empire writing table stood near the window. A deep-cushioned divan stretched along the wall opposite the fireplace. So much had Frobisher noticed when the light again went out. Hanaud closed the door upon the room again. "We shall be hidden in the embrasure of any of these windows," Hanaud whispered, when they were once more in the long gallery. "No light will be shown here with that shutter hanging loose, we may be sure. Meanwhile, let us watch and be very silent." They took their stations in the deep shadows by the side of the window with the broken shutter. They could see dimly the courtyard and the great carriage doors in the wall at the end of it, and they waited. Jim Frobisher, under such a strain of dread and expectancy that each second seemed an hour, and he wondered at the immobility of his companions. The only sound of breathing that he heard came from his own lungs. In a while Hanaud laid a hand upon his sleeve, and the clasp of the hand tightened and tightened. Motionless, though he stood like a man in a seizure, Hanaud too was in the grip of an intense excitement. For one of the great leaves of the courtyard door was opening silently. It opened just a little way, and as silently closed again. But someone had slipped in, so vague and swift and noiseless a figure that Jim would have believed his imagination had misled him but for a thicker blot of darkness at the center of the great door. There someone stood now who had not stood there a minute before, as silent and still as any of the watchers in the gallery, and more still than one. For Hanaud moved suddenly away on the tips of his toes into the deepest of the gloom, and sinking down upon his heels, drew his watch from his pocket. He drew his coat closely about it, and for a fraction of a second flashed his torchlight on the dial. It was now 5 minutes past 12. "It is the time," he breathed as he crept back to his place. "Listen now." A minute passed, and another. Frobisher found himself shivering as a man shivers at a photographer's when he is told by the operator to keep still. He had a notion that he was going to fall. Then a distant noise caught his ear, and at once his nerves grew steady. It was the throb of a motorcycle, and it grew louder and louder. He felt Hanaud stiffen at his side. Hanaud had been right, then. The conviction deepened in his mind. When all that had been darkness and confusion to him, Hanaud from the first had seen clearly. But what had he seen? Frobisher was still unable to answer that question, and whilst he fumbled among conjectures, a vast relief swept over him, for the noise of the cycle had ceased altogether. It had roared through some contiguous street and gone upon its way into the open country. Not the faintest pulsation of its engine was any longer audible. That late faring traveler had taken Dijon in his stride. In a revulsion of relief, he pictured him devouring the road, the glow of his lamp putting the stars to shame, the miles leaping away behind him, and suddenly the pleasant picture was struck from before his vision, and his heart fluttered up into his throat. for the leaf of the great coach door was swung wider and closed again, and the motorcycle with its sidecar was within the courtyard. The rider had slipped out his clutch and stopped his engine more than 100 yards away in the other street. His own impetus had been enough, and more than enough, to swing him round the corner along the road and into the courtyard. The man who had closed the door moved to his side as he dismounted. Between them they lifted something from the sidecar and laid it on the ground. The watchman held open the door again. The cyclist wheeled out his machine. The door was closed. A key turned in the lock. Not a word had been spoken, not an unnecessary movement made. It had all happened within the space of a few seconds. The man waited by the gate, and in a little while from some other street the cyclist engine was heard once more to throb. His work was done. Jim Frobisher wondered that Hanaud should let him go. But Hanaud had eyes for no one but the man who was left behind, and the big package upon the ground under the blank side wall. The man moved to it, stooped, raised it with an appearance of effort, then stood upright, holding it in his arms. It was something shapeless and long and heavy. So much the watchers in the gallery could see, but no more. The man in the courtyard moved towards the door without a sound, and Hanaud drew his companions back from the window of the broken shutter. Quick as they were only just in time to escape from that revealing twilight. Already the intruder with his burden stood within the gallery. The front door was unlatched, that was clear. It had needed but a touch to open it. The intruder moved without a sound to the double door, of which Hanaud had opened one leaf. He stood in front of it, pushed it with his foot, and both the leaves swung inwards. He disappeared into the room, but the faint, misty light had fallen upon him for a second, and though none could imagine who he was, they all three saw that what he carried was a heavy sack. Now, at all events, Hanaud would move, thought Frobisher, but he did not. They all heard the man now, but not his footsteps. It was just the brushing of his clothes against furniture. Then came a soft, almost inaudible sound, as though he had laid his burden down upon the deep cushioned couch. Then he himself reappeared in the doorway, his arms empty, his hat pressed down upon his forehead, and a dim whiteness where his face should be. But dark as it was, they saw the glitter of his eyes. "It will be now," Frobisher said to himself, expecting that Hanaud would leap from the gloom and bear the intruder to the ground. But this man, too, Hanaud let go. He closed the doors again, drawing the two leaves together, and stole from the gallery. No one heard the outer door close, but with a startling loudness some metal thing rang upon stone, and within the house. Even Jim Frobisher understood that the outer door had been locked, and the key dropped through the letter slot. The three men crept back to their window. They saw the intruder cross the courtyard, open one leaf of the coach door, peer this way and that, and go. Again a key tinkled upon stones. The key of the great door had been pushed or kicked underneath it back into the courtyard. The clocks suddenly chimed the quarter. To Frobisher's amazement, it was 12:15. Between the moment when the cyclist rode his car in at the doors and now, just 5 minutes had elapsed, and again, but for the three men, the house was empty. Or was it empty? For Hanaud had slipped across to the door of the room and opened it, and a slight sound broke out of that black room, as of some living thing which moved uneasily. At Jim Frobisher's elbow, Hanaud breathed a sigh of relief. Something, it seemed, had happened for which he had hardly dared to hope. Some great dread, he knew with certainty, had not been fulfilled. On the heels of that sigh, a sharp, loud click rang out, the release of a spring, the withdrawal of a bolt. Hanaud drew the door swiftly to, and the three men fell back. Someone had somehow entered that room. Someone was moving quietly about it. From the corner of the corridor in which they had taken refuge, the three men saw the leaves of the door swing very slowly in upon their hinges. Someone appeared upon the threshold and stood motionless, listening, and after a few seconds advanced across the gallery to the window. It was a girl, so much they could determine from the contours of her head and the slim neck. To the surprise of those three, a second shadow flitted to her side. Both of them peered from the window into the courtyard. There was nothing to tell them there whether the midnight visitors had come and gone, or not yet come at all. One of them whispered, "The key!" and the other, the shorter one, crept into the hall and returned with the key, which had been dropped through the letter slot, in her hand. The taller of the two laughed, and the sound of it, so clear, so joyous, like the trill of a bird, it was impossible for Jim Frobisher, even for a second, to mistake. The second girl, standing at the window of this dark and secret house, with the key in her hand to tell her that all that had been plotted had been done, was Betty Harlow. Jim Frobisher had never imagined a sound so sinister, so alarming, as that clear, joyous laughter lilting through the silent gallery. It startled him. It set his whole faith in the world shuddering. There must be some good explanation, he argued, but his heart was sinking amidst terrors. Of what dreadful event was that laughter to be the prelude? The two figures at the window flitted back across the gallery. It seemed that there was no further reason for precautions. "Shut the door, Francine," said Betty in her ordinary voice, and when that was done, within the room the lights went on. But time and disuse had warped the doors. They did not quite close, and between them a golden strip of light showed like a wand. "Let us see now," cried Betty. "Let us see." And again she laughed, and under the cover of her laughter the three men crept forward and looked in. Moreau upon his knees, Frobisher stooping above him, Hanaud at his full height behind them all. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, The Corona Machine. The detective's hand fell softly upon Frobisher's shoulder, warning him to silence, and this warning was needed. The lustres of the big glass chandelier were so many flashing jewels. The mirrors of the girandoles multiplied their candle lamps. The small, gay room was ablaze, and in the glare Betty stood and laughed. Her white shoulders rose from a slim evening frock of black velvet. From her carefully dressed copper hair to her black satin shoes, she was as trim as if she had just been unpacked from a bandbox, and she was laughing wholeheartedly at a closed sack on the divan, a sack which jerked and flapped grotesquely like a fish on a beach. Someone was imprisoned within that sack. Jim Frobisher could not doubt who that someone was, and it seemed to him that no sound more soulless and cruel had ever been heard in the world than Betty's merriment. She threw her head back. Jim could see her slender white throat working, her shoulders flashing and shaking. She clapped her hands with a horrible glee. Something died within Frobisher's breast as he heard it. Was it in his heart, he wondered? It was, however, to be the last time that Betty Harlow laughed. "You can get her out, Francine," she said, and whilst Francine, with a pair of scissors, cut the end of the sack loose, she sat down with her back to it at the writing table and unlocked a drawer. The sack was cut away and thrown upon the floor, and now on the divan an Upcott lay in her gleaming dancing dress, her hands bound behind her back, and her ankles tied cruelly together. Her hair was disheveled, her face flushed, and she had the look of one quite dazed. She drew in deep breaths of air, with her bosom laboring, but she was unaware for the moment of her predicament or surroundings, and her eyes rested upon Francine and traveled from her to Betty's back without a gleam of recognition. She wrenched a little at her wrists, but even that movement was instinctive, and then she closed her eyes and lay still. So still that, but for her breathing, the watchers at the door would hardly have believed that she still lived. Betty, meanwhile, lifted from the open drawer, first a small bottle half filled with a pale yellow liquid, and next a small case of morocco leather. From the case, she took a hypodermic syringe and its needle and screwed the two parts together. "Is she ready?" Betty asked as she removed the stopper from the bottle. "Quite, mademoiselle," answered Francine. She began with a giggle, but she looked at the prisoner as she spoke, and she ended with a startled gasp, for Anne was looking straight at her with the strangest, disconcerting stare. It was impossible to say whether she knew Francine, or knowing her would not admit her knowledge, but her gaze never faltered. It was actually terrifying by its fixity, and in a sharp, hysterical voice, Francine suddenly cried out, "Turn your eyes away from me, will you?" And she added with a shiver, "It's horrible, mademoiselle. It's like a dead person watching you as you move about the room." Betty turned curiously towards the divan, and Anne's eyes wandered off to her. It seemed as though it needed just that interchange of glances to awaken her. For as Betty resumed her work of filling the hypodermic syringe from the bottle, a look of perplexity crept into Anne Upcott's face. She tried to sit up, and finding that she could not, tore at the cords which bound her wrists. Her feet kicked upon the divan. A moan of pain broke from her lips, and with that, consciousness returned to her. "Betty!" she whispered, and Betty turned with the needle ready in her hand. She did not speak, but her face spoke for her. Her upper lip was drawn back a little from her teeth, and there was a look in her great eyes which appalled Jim Frobisher outside the door. Once before he had seen just that look, when Betty was lying on Mrs. Harlowe's bed for Hanaud's experiment, and he had lingered in the treasure-room with Anne Upcott. It had been inscrutable to him then, but it was as plain as print now. It meant murder. And so Anne Upcott understood it. Helpless as she was, she shrank back upon the divan. In a panic she spoke with faltering lips, and her eyes fixed upon Betty with a dreadful fascination. "Betty, you had me taken and brought here. You sent me to Madame Levaye's on purpose. Oh, the letter, then, the anonymous letter!" And a new light broke in upon Anne's mind. A new terror shook her. "You wrote it, Betty, you, the scourge!" She sank back and again struggled vainly with her bonds. Betty rose from her chair and crossed the room towards her, the needle shining bright in her hand. Her hapless prisoner saw it. "What's that?" she cried, and she screamed aloud. The extremity of her horror lent to her an unnatural strength. Somehow she dragged herself up and got her feet to the ground. Somehow she stood upright, swaying as she stood. "You are going to—" she began and broke off. "Oh, no, you couldn't! Betty put out a hand and laid it on Anne's shoulder and held her so for a moment, savoring her vengeance. "Whose face was it bending so close down over yours in the darkness?" she asked, in a soft and dreadful voice. "Whose face, Anne? Guess." She shook her swaying prisoner with a gentleness as dreadful as her quiet voice. "You talk too much. Your tongue's dangerous, Anne. You are too curious, Anne. What were you doing in the treasure-room yesterday evening with your watch in your hand, eh? Can't you answer, you pretty fool?" Then Betty's voice changed. It remained low and quiet, but hatred crept into it, a deep, whole-hearted hatred. "You have been interfering with me, too, haven't you, Anne? Oh, we both understand very well." And Hanaud's hand tightened upon Frobisher's shoulder. Here was the real key and explanation of Betty's hatred. Anne Upcott knew too much, and was getting to know more, might at any moment light upon the whole truth. Yes, Anne Upcott's disappearance would look like a panic-stricken flight, would have the effect of a confession, no doubt. But above all these considerations, paramount in Betty Harlowe's mind was the resolve at once to punish and rid herself of a rival. "All this week you have been thrusting yourself in my way," she said, "and here's your reward for it, Anne. Yes, I had you bound hand and foot and brought here. The water-lily." She looked her victim over as she stood in her delicate, bright frock, her white silk stockings and satin slippers, swaying in terror. 15 minutes, Anne. That fool of a detective was right. 15 minutes. That's all the time the arrow poison takes. Anne's eyes opened wide. The blood rushed into her white face and ebbed, leaving it whiter than it was before. "Arrow poison!" she cried. "Betty, it was you then! Oh!" She would have fallen forward, but Betty Harlow pushed her shoulder gently, and she fell back upon the divan. That Betty had been guilty of that last infamy, the murder of her benefactress, not until this moment had Anne Upcott for one moment suspected. It was clear to her, too, that there was not the slightest hope for her. She burst suddenly into a storm of tears. Betty Harlow sat down on the divan opposite her and watched her closely and curiously, with a devilish enjoyment. The sound of the girl's sobbing was music in her ears. She would not let it flag. "You shall lie here in the dark all night, Anne, and alone," she said in a low voice, bending over her. "Tomorrow Espinosa will put you under one of the stone flags in the kitchen, but tonight you shall lie just as you are. Come." She bent over Anne Upcott, gathering the flesh of her arm with one hand and advancing the needle with the other, and a piercing scream burst from Francine Royard. "Look!" she cried, and she pointed to the door. It was open, and Hanaud stood upon the threshold. Betty looked up at the cry, and the blood receded from her face. She sat like an image of wax, staring at the open doorway, and a moment afterwards, with a gesture swift as lightning, she drove the needle into the flesh of her own arm and emptied it. Frobisher, with a cry of horror, started forward to prevent her, but Hanaud roughly thrust him back. "I warned you, monsieur, not to interfere," he said, with a savage note in his voice, which Jim had not heard before, and Betty Harlow dropped the needle onto the couch, whence it rolled to the floor. She sprang up now to her full height, her heels together, her arms stretched from her sides. 15 minutes, Monsieur Hanaud," she cried with bravado. "I am safe from you." Hanaud laughed and wagged his forefinger contemptuously in her face. "Colored water, mademoiselle, doesn't kill." Betty swayed upon her feet and steadied herself. "Bluff, Monsieur Hanaud," she said. "We shall see." The confidence of his tone convinced her. She flashed across the room to her writing table. Swift as she was, Hanaud met her there. "Oh, no," he cried, "that's quite a different thing." He seized her wrists. "Moreau," he called, with a nod towards Francine, "and you, Monsieur Frobisher, will you release that young lady, if you please?" Moreau dragged Francine Royard from the room and locked her safely away. Jim seized upon the big scissors and cut the cords about Anne's wrists and ankles, and unwound them. He was aware that Hanaud had flung the chair from the writing table into an open space, that Betty was struggling and then was still, that Hanaud had forced her into the chair and snatched up one of the cords which Frobisher had dropped upon the floor. When he had finished his work, he saw that Betty was sitting with her hands in handcuffs and her ankles tied to one of the legs of the chair, and Hanaud was staunching with his handkerchief a wound in his hand, which bled. Betty had bitten him like a wild animal caught in a trap. "Yes, you warned me, mademoiselle, the first morning I met you," Hanaud said with a savage irony, "that you didn't wear a wristwatch because you hated things on your wrist. My apologies. I had forgotten." He went back to the writing table and thrust his hand into the drawer. He drew out a small cardboard box and removed the lid. "5," he said. "Yes, 5." He carried the box across the room to Frobisher, who was standing against the wall with a face like death. "Look." There were 5 white tablets in the box. "We know where the 6th is, or rather we know where it was, for I had it analyzed today. Cyanide of potassium, my friend. Crunch one of them between your teeth, and 15 minutes? Not a bit of it. A fraction of a second. That's all." Frobisher leaned forward and whispered in Hanaud's ear, "Leave them within her reach." His first instinctive thought had been to hinder Betty from destroying herself. Now he prayed that she might, and with so desperate a longing that a deep pity softened Hanaud's eyes. "I must not, monsieur," he said gently. He turned to Moreau. "There is a cab waiting at the corner of the Maison Grenelle," and Moreau went in search of it. Hanaud went over to Anne Upcott, who was sitting upon the divan, her head bowed, her body shivering. Every now and then she handled and eased one of her tortured wrists. "Mademoiselle," he said, standing in front of her, "I owe you an explanation and an apology. I never from the beginning, no, not for one moment, believed that you were guilty of the murder of Madame Harlowe. I was sure that you had never touched the necklace of pink pearls. Oh, at once I was sure, long before I found it. I believed every word of the story you told us in the garden. But none of this dared I show you, for only by pretending that I was convinced of your guilt could I protect you during this last week in the Maison Grenelle." "Thank you, monsieur," she replied, with a wan effort at a smile. "But for tonight I owe you an apology," he continued. "I make it with shame. That you were to be brought back here to the tender mercies of Mademoiselle Betty, I hadn't a doubt, and I was here to make sure you should be spared them. But I have never in my life had a more difficult case to deal with, so clear a conviction in my own mind, so little proof to put before a court. I had to have the evidence which I was certain to find in this room tonight. But I ask you to believe me that if I had imagined for a moment the cruelty with which you were to be handled, I should have sacrificed this evidence. I beg you to forgive me." Anne Upcott held out her hand. "Monsieur Hanaud," she replied simply, "but for you I should not now be alive. I should be lying here in the dark and alone, as it was promised to me, waiting for Espinosa and his spade." Her voice broke, and she shuddered violently so that the divan shook on which she sat. "You must forget these miseries," he said gently. "You have youth, as I told you once before. A little time, and—" The return of Nicolas Moreau interrupted them, and with Moreau came a couple of gendarmes and Giraudeau, the commissaire. "You have Francine Rouard?" Hanaud asked. "You can hear her," Moreau returned dryly. In the corridor a commotion arose, the scuffling of feet, and a woman's voice screaming abuse. It died away. "Mademoiselle here will not give you so much trouble," said Hanaud. Betty was sitting huddled in her chair, her face averted and sullen, her lips muttering inaudible words. She had not once looked at Jim Frobisher since he had entered the room, nor did she now. Moreau stooped and untied her ankles, and a big gendarme raised her up. But her knees failed beneath her. She could not stand. Her strength and her spirit had left her. The gendarme picked her up as if she had been a child, and as he moved to the door, Jim Frobisher planted himself in front of him. "Stop!" he cried, and his voice was strong and resonant. "Monsieur Hanaud, you have said just now that you believed every word of Mademoiselle Anne's story. It is true. You believe, then, that Madame Harlowe was murdered at 10:30 on the night of the 27th of April, and at 10:30 Mademoiselle here was at Monsieur de Pauilhac's ball. You will set her free." Hanaud did not argue the point. "And what of tonight?" he asked. "Stand aside, if you please." Jim held his ground for a moment or two, and then drew aside. He stood with his eyes closed and such a look of misery upon his face as Betty was carried out, that Hanaud attempted some clumsy word of condolence. "This has been a bitter experience for you, Monsieur Frobisher," he began. "Would that you had taken me into your confidence at the first," Jim cried volubly. "Would you have believed me if I had?" asked Hanaud, and Jim was silent. "As it was, Monsieur Frobisher, I took a grave risk which I know now I had not the right to take, and I told you more than you think." He turned away towards Moreau. "Lock the courtyard doors and the door of the house after they have gone, and bring the keys here to me." Giraudeau had made a bundle of the solution, the hypodermic syringe, the tablets of cyanide, and the pieces of cord. "There is something here of importance," Hanaud observed, and stooping at the writing table, he picked up a square, flat-topped black case. "You will recognize this," he remarked to Jim as he handed it to Giraudeau. It was the case of a Corona typewriting machine, and from its weight the machine itself was clearly within the case. "Yes," Hanaud explained as the door closed upon the commissaire, "this pretty room is the factory where all those abominable letters were prepared. Here the information was filed away for use. Here the letters were typed. From here they were issued." "Blackmailing letters!" cried Jim. "Letters demanding money." "Some of them," answered Hanaud. "But Betty Harlow had money, all that she needed, and more if she chose to ask for it." "All that she needed? No," answered Hanaud with a shake of the head. "The blackmailer never has enough money, for no one is so blackmailed." A sudden and irrational fury seized upon Frobisher. They had agreed, he and Hanaud, that there was a gang involved in all these crimes. It might be that Betty was of them, yes, even led them, but were they all to go scot-free? "There are others," he exclaimed. "The man who rode this motorcycle." "Young Espinosa," replied Hanaud. "Did you notice his accent when you stopped at the fork of the roads in the Val d'Arzon? He did not mount his cycle again. No. And the man who carried in the sack?" "Maurice Thevenet," said Hanaud, "that promising young novice. He is now at the depot. He will never get that good word from me, which was to unlock Paris for him." "And Espinosa himself, who was to come here tomorrow?" He stopped abruptly with his eyes on Anne. "And who murdered Jean Cladel, eh?" Hanaud went on. "A fool, that fellow. Why use the Catalan's knife in the Catalan's way?" Hanaud looked at his watch. "It is over. No doubt Espinosa is under lock and key by now, and there are others, monsieur, of whom you have never heard. The net has been cast wide tonight. Have no fear of that." Moreau returned with the keys and handed them to Hanaud. Hanaud put them into a pocket and went over to Anne Upcott. "Mademoiselle, I shall not trouble you with any explanations tonight. Tomorrow you will tell me why you went to Madame Levet's ball. It was given out that you meant to run away. That, of course, was not true. You shall give me the real reason tomorrow, and an account of what happened to you there." Anne shivered at the memories of that night, but she answered quietly, "Yes, I will tell you everything." "Good, then we can go," said Hanaud cheerfully. "Go?" Anne Upcott asked in wonderment. "But you have had us all locked in." Hanaud laughed. He had a little surprise to spring on the girl, and he loved surprises so long as they were of his own contriving. "Monsieur Frobisher, I think, must have guessed the truth. This house, mademoiselle, the Hôtel de Brébizard, is very close, as the crow flies, to the Maison Grenelle. There is one row of houses, the houses of the street of Charles Robert, between. It was built by Etienne Bouchard de Grenelle, President of the Parliament during the reign of Louis XV, a very dignified and important figure, and he built it, mademoiselle, this is the point, at the same time that he built the Maison Grenelle. Having built it, he installed in it a joyous lady of the province from which it takes its name, Madame de Brébizard. There was no scandal, for the president never came visiting Madame de Brébizard, and for the best of reasons. Between this house and the Maison Grenelle, he had constructed a secret passage in the age of secret passages. Frobisher was startled. Hanaud had given credit to him for an astuteness which he did not possess. He had been occupied, heart and brain, by the events of the evening. So rapidly had they followed one upon the other, so little time had they allowed for speculations. "How in the world did you discover this?" he asked. "Oh, you shall know in due time. For the moment, let us content ourselves with the facts," Hanaud continued. "After the death of Etienne de Grenelle, at some period or other, the secret of this passage was lost. It is clear, too, I think, that it fell into disrepair and became blocked. At all events, at the end of the 18th century, the Hôtel de Brébizard passed into other hands than those of the owner of the Maison Grenelle. Simon Harlow, however, discovered the secret. He bought back the Hôtel de Brébizard, restored the passage, and put it to the same use as old Etienne de Grenelle had done. For here Madame Raviat came to live during the years before the death of her husband set her free to marry Simon. There, my little lecture is over. Let us go." He bowed low to Anne like a lecturer to his audience, and unlatched the double doors of the big buhl cabinet in the recess of the wall. A cry of surprise broke from Anne, who had risen unsteadily to her feet. The cabinet was quite empty. There was not so much as a shelf, and all could see that the floor of it was tilted up against one end, and that a flight of steps ran downwards in the thickness of the wall. "Come," said Hanaud, producing his electric torch. "Will you take this, Monsieur Frobisher, and go first with Mademoiselle? I will turn out the lights and follow." But Anne, with a little frown upon her forehead, drew sharply back. She put a hand to Hanaud's sleeve and steadied herself by it. "I will come with you," she said. "I am not very steady on my legs." She laughed her action off, but both men understood it. Jim Frobisher had thought her guilty of theft and murder. She shrank from him to the man who had no doubt that she was innocent, and even that was not all. She was wounded by Jim's distrust more deeply than anyone else could have wounded her. Frobisher inclined his head in acknowledgment, and pressing the button of the torch, descended 5 or 6 of the narrow steps. Moreau followed him. "You are ready, mademoiselle? So?" said Hanaud. He put an arm about her to steady her, and pressed up a switch by the open doors of the cabinet. The room was plunged in darkness. Guided by the beam of light, they followed Frobisher onto the steps. Hanaud closed the doors of the cabinet and fastened them together with the bolts. "Forward!" he cried, "and you, mademoiselle, be careful of your heels on these stone steps." When his head was just below the level of the first step, he called upon Frobisher to halt and raise the torch. Then he slid the floorboard of the cabinet back into its place. Beneath this a trap door hung downwards. Hanaud raised it and bolted it in place. "We can go on." 10 more steps brought them to a tiny vaulted hall. From that a passage, bricked and paved, led into the darkness. Frobisher led the way along the passage until the foot of another flight of steps was reached. "Where do these steps lead, my friend?" Hanaud asked of Frobisher, his voice sounding with a strange hollowness in that tunnel. "You shall tell me." Jim, with memories of that night when he and Anne and Betty had sat in the dark of the perfumed garden, and Anne's eyes had searched this way and that amidst the gloom of the sycamores, answered promptly, "Into the garden of the Maison Grenelle." Hanaud chuckled. "And you, mademoiselle, what do you say?" Anne's face clouded over. "I know now," she said gravely. Then she shivered and drew her cloak slowly about her shoulders. "Let us go up and see." Hanaud took the lead. He lowered a trap door at the top of the steps, touched a spring, and slid back a panel. "Wait," said he, and he sprang out and turned on a light. Anne Upcott, Jim Frobisher, and Moreau climbed out of Simon Harlow's sedan chair into the treasure room. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23, The Truth About the Clock. To the amazement of them all, Moreau began to laugh. Up till now he had been alert, competent, and without expression. Stolidity had been the mark of him, and now he laughed in great gusts, holding his sides and then wringing his hands, as though the humor of things was altogether unbearable. Once or twice he tried to speak, but laughter leapt upon the words and drowned them. "What in the world is the matter with you, Nicholas?" Hanaud asked. "But I beg your pardon," Moreau stammered, and again merriment seized and mastered him. At last 2 intelligible words were heard. "Oui, Girardeau," he cried, settling an imaginary pair of glasses on the bridge of his nose, and went off into a fit. Gradually, the reason of his paroxysms was explained in broken phrases. "We, Girardeau, we fix the seals upon the doors, and all the time there is a way in and out under our nose. Those rooms must not be disturbed. No, the great Monsieur Hanaud is coming from Paris to look at them. So we seal them tight. We, Girardeau. My God, but we, Girardeau, look the fool. So careful and pompous with our linen bands. We, Girardeau, shall make the laughter at the assize court. Yes, I think we, Girardeau, shall hand in our resignation before the trial is over." Perhaps Moreau's humor was a little too professional for his audience. Perhaps, too, the circumstances of that night had dulled their appreciation. Certainly, Moreau had all the laughter to himself. Jim Frobisher was driven to the little Louis XV clock upon the marquetry cabinet. He never could for a moment forget it. So much hung for Betty Harlow upon its existence. Whatever wild word she might have used tonight, there was the incontrovertible testimony of the clock to prove that she had had no hand whatever in the murder of Mrs. Harlow. He drew his own watch from his pocket and compared it with the clock. "It is exact to the minute," he declared, with a little accent of triumph. "It is now 23 minutes past 1, and suddenly Hanaud was at his side with a curious air of alertness. "Is it so?" he asked, and he too made sure by a comparison with his own watch that Frobisher's statement was correct. "Yes, 23 minutes past 1. That is very fortunate." He called Anne Upcott and Moreau to him, and they all now stood grouped about the cabinet. "The key to the mystery about this clock," he remarked, "is to be found in the words which Mademoiselle Anne used when the seals were removed from the doors, and she saw this clock again in the light of day. She was perplexed. Isn't that so, mademoiselle?" "Yes," Anne returned. It seems to me still, that the clock was somehow placed higher than it actually is." "Exactly. Let us put it to the test." He looked at the clock and saw that the hands now reached 26 minutes past 1. "I will ask you all to go out of this room and wait in the hall in the dark, for it was in the dark, you will remember, that mademoiselle descended the stairs. I shall turn the lights out here and call you in. When I do, mademoiselle will switch the lights on and off swiftly, just as she did on the night of the 27th of April. Then I think all will be clear to you." He crossed to the door leading into the hall and found it locked with the key upon the inside. "Of course," he said, "when the passage is used to the Hôtel de Brabazar, this door would be locked." He turned the key and drew the door towards him. The hall gaped before them, black and silent. Hanaud stood aside. "If you please." Moreau and Frobisher went out. Anne Upcott hesitated and cast a look of appeal towards Hanaud. Her perplexities were to be set at rest. She did not doubt that. This man had saved her from death when it seemed that nothing could save her. Her trust in him was absolute, but her perplexities were unimportant. Some stroke was to be delivered upon Betty Harlow from which there could be no recovery. Anne Upcott was not a good hater of Betty's stamp. She shrank from the thought that it was to be her hand that would deliver that stroke. "Courage, mademoiselle!" Hanaud exhorted her with a friendly smile, and Anne joined the others in the dark hall. Hanaud closed the door upon them and returned to the clock. It was 28 minutes past 1. "I have 2 minutes," he said to himself. "That will just do if I am quick." Outside, the 3 witnesses waited in the darkness. One of the 3 shivered suddenly, so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. "Anne," Jim Frobisher whispered, and he put his hand within her arm. Anne Upcott had come to the end of her strength. She clung to his hand spasmodically. "Jim," she answered under her breath, "oh, but you were cruel to me." Hanaud's voice called to them from within the room. "Come." Anne stepped forward, felt for and found the handle. She threw open the door with a nervous violence. The treasure room was pitch dark like the hall. Anne stepped through the doorway, and her fingers reached for the switch. "Now," she warned them in a voice which shook. Suddenly the treasure room blazed with light. As suddenly it was black again, and in the darkness rose a clamor of voices. "10:30. I saw the hour," cried Jim. "And again the clock was higher," exclaimed Anne. "That is true," Moreau agreed. Hanaud's voice from the far corner of the room joined in. "Is that exactly what you saw, mademoiselle, on the night of the 27th? "Exactly, monsieur." "Then turn on the lights again and know the truth." The injunction was uttered in tones so grave that it sounded like a knell. For a second or two, Anne's fingers refused their service. Once more the conviction forced itself into her mind. Some irretrievable calamity waited upon the movement of her hand. "Courage, mademoiselle." Again the light shone, and this time they remained burning. The 3 witnesses advanced into the room, and as they looked again, From close at hand and with a longer gaze, a cry of surprise broke from all of them. There was no clock upon the marquetry cabinet at all. But high above it, on the long mirror before which it stood, there was the reflection of a clock, its white face so clear and bright that even now it was difficult to disbelieve that this was the clock itself, and the position of the hands gave the hour as precisely 10:30. "Now turn about and see," said Hanaud. The clock itself stood upon the shelf of the Adam mantelpiece, and there, staring at them, the true hour was marked. It was exactly 1:30. The long minute hand pointing to 6, the shorter hour hand on the right-hand side of the figure 12, halfway between the 1 and the 2. With a simultaneous movement, they all turned again to the mirror, and the mystery was explained. The shorter half-hour hand seen in the mirror was on the left-hand side of the figure 12, and just where it would have been if the hour had been 10:30, and the clock actually where its reflection was. The figures on the dial were reversed, and difficult at first glance to read. "You see," Hanaud explained, "it is the law of nature to save itself from effort even in the smallest things. We live with clocks and watches. They are as customary as our daily bread. And with the instinct to save ourselves from effort, we take our time from the position of the hands. We take the actual figures of the hours for granted. Mademoiselle comes out of the dark. In the one swift flash of light, she sees the hands upon the clock's face, 10:30. She herself, you will remember, Monsieur Frobisher, was surprised that the hour was so early. She was cold, as though she had slept long in her armchair. She had the impression that she had slept long, and Mademoiselle was right, for the time was 1:30, and Betty Harlow had been 20 minutes home from Monsieur Pauilhac's ball." Hanaud ended with a note of triumph in his voice which exasperated Frobisher. "Aren't you going a little too fast?" he asked. "When the seals were removed and we entered this room for the first time, the clock was not upon the mantel-shelf, but upon the marquetry cabinet." Hanaud nodded. "Mademoiselle Upcott told us her story before luncheon. We entered this room after luncheon. During the luncheon hours, the position of the clock was changed." He pointed to the sedan chair. "You know now with what ease that could be done." Could, Frobisher repeated impatiently. "It doesn't follow that it was done." "That is true," Hanaud replied. "So I will answer now one of the questions in your memorandum. What was it that I saw from the top of the terrace tower? I saw the smoke rising from this chimney into the air. Oh, monsieur, I had paid attention to this house, its windows and its doors and its chimney stacks. And there, at midday, in all the warmth of late May, the smoke was rising from the chimney of the sealed room. There was an entrance then of which we knew nothing, and somebody had just made use of it. Who? Ask yourself that. Who went straight out from the Maison Grenelle the moment I had gone, and went alone? That clock had to be changed. Apparently some letters also had to be burnt." Jim hardly heard the last sentence. The clock still occupied his thoughts. His great argument had been riddled. His one dream of establishing Betty's innocence in despite of every presumption and fact which could be brought against her had been dispelled. He dropped onto a chair. "You understood it all so quickly," he said with bitterness. "Oh, I was not quick," Hanaud answered. "Ascribe to me no gifts out of the ordinary run, monsieur. I am trained, that is all. I have been my 20 minutes in the bull-ring. Listen how it came about." He looked at Frobisher with a comical smile. "It is a pity our eager young friend, Maurice Thévenet, is not here to profit by the lesson. First of all, then, I knew that Mademoiselle Betty was here doing something of great importance. It may be only burning those letters in the hearth. It may be more. I must wait and see. Good. There, standing before the mirror, Mademoiselle Anne makes her little remark that the clock seemed higher. Do I understand yet? No, but I am interested. Then I notice a curious thing, a beautiful specimen of Benvenuto Cellini's work set up high and flat on that mantel-shelf where no one can see it. So I take it down, and I carry it to the window, and I admire it very much, and I carry it back to the mantel-shelf. And then I noticed 4 little marks upon the wood which had been concealed by the flat case of the jewel, and those 4 little marks are just the marks which the feet of that very pretty Louis Quinze clock might have made had it stood regularly there in its natural place. Yes, at the top of that marquetry cabinet, so much lower than the mantel-shelf is, too, the natural place for the Cellini jewel. Everyone can see it there. So I say to myself, my good Hanaud, this young lady has been rearranging her ornaments. But do I guess why? No, my friend. I told you once, and I tell you again very humbly, that we are the servants of chance. Chance is a good mistress if her servants do not go to sleep, and she treated me well that afternoon. See, I'm standing in the hall, in great trouble about this case, for nothing leads me anywhere. There is a big old-fashioned barometer like a frying pan on the wall behind me, and a mirror on the opposite wall in front of me. I raise my eyes from the floor, and by chance I see in the mirror the barometer behind me. By chance my attention is arrested, for I see that the indicator in the barometer points to stormy weather, which is ridiculous. I turn me about so. It is to fine weather that the indicator points, and in a flash I see. I look at the position of the hand without looking at the letters. If I look the barometer in the face, the hand points to the fair weather. If I turn my back and look into the mirror, the hand points to the stormy weather. Now, indeed, I have it. I run into the treasure room. I lock the door, for I do not wish to be caught. I do not move the clock. No, for nothing in the world will I move that clock. But I take out my watch. I face the mirror. I hold my watch facing the mirror. I open the glass, and I move the hands until in the mirror they seem to mark 10:30. Then I look at my watch itself. It is 1:30. So now I know. Do I want more proof? Monsieur, I get it. For as I unlock the door and open it again, there is Mademoiselle Betty face to face with me. That young girl. Even though already I suspect her, I get a shock, I can tell you. The good God knows that I am hardened enough against surprises, but for a moment the mask had slipped from her face. I felt a trickle of ice down my spine, for out of her beautiful great eyes murder looked. He stood held in a spell by the memory of that fierce look. Ugh, he grunted, and he shook himself like a great dog coming out of the water. But you are talking too much, Monsieur Frobisher, he cried in a different voice, and you are keeping Mademoiselle from her bed, where she should have been an hour ago. Come. He drove his companions out into the hall, turned on the lights, locked the door of the treasure room, and pocketed the key. Mademoiselle, we will leave these lights burning, he said gently to Anne, and Moreau will keep watch in the house. You have nothing to fear. He will not be far from your door. Good night. Anne gave him her hand with a wan smile. I shall thank you tomorrow, she said, and she mounted the stairs slowly, her feet dragging, her body swaying with her fatigue. Hanaud watched her go, and then he turned to Frobisher with a whimsical smile. What a pity, he said. No. After all, perhaps, and he broke off hurriedly. Frobisher was growing red and beginning to look proper, and the last thing which Hanaud wished to do was to offend him in this particular. I make my apologies, he said. I am impertinent and a gossip. If I err, it is because I wish you very well. You understand that? Good. Then a further proof. Tomorrow Mademoiselle will tell us what happened to her tonight, how she came to go to the house of Madame Levay. Everything. I wish you to be present. You shall know everything. I shall tell you myself, step by step, how my conclusions were reached. All your questions shall be answered. I will give you every help, every opportunity. I shall see to it that you are not even called as a witness of what you have seen tonight. And when it is all over, monsieur, you will see with me that whatever there may be of pain and distress, the law must take its course. It was a new Hanaud whom Frobisher was now contemplating. The tricks, the gasconades, the buffooneries had gone. He did not even triumph. A dignity shone out of the man like a strong light, and with it he was gentle and considerate. "Good night, monsieur," he said, and bowed, and Jim, on an impulse, thrust out his hand. "Good night," he returned. Hanaud took it with a smile of recognition and went away. Jim Frobisher locked the front door and, with a sense of desolation, turned back to the hall. He heard the big iron gates swing to. They had been left open, of course, he recognized, in the usual way when one of the household was going to be late. Yes, everything had been planned with the care of a commander planning a battle. Here in this house the servants were all tucked up in their beds, but for Hanaud, Betty Harlow might at this very moment have been stealing up these stairs noiselessly to her own room, her dreadful work accomplished. The servants would have waked tomorrow to the knowledge that Anne Upcott had fled rather than face a trial. Sometime in the evening, Espinosa would have called, would have been received in the treasure room, would have found the spade waiting for him in the great stone-vaulted kitchen of the Hôtel de Brabazard. Oh, yes, all dangers had been foreseen, except Hanaud. Nay, even he, in a measure, had been foreseen, for a panic-stricken telegram had reached Frobisher and Hazlitt before Hanaud had started upon his work. "I shall be on the stairs, monsieur, below mademoiselle's door, if you should want me," said Moreau. Jim Frobisher roused himself from his reflections. "Thank you," he answered, and he went up the stairs to his room. A lot of use to Betty that telegram had been, he reflected bitterly. Where was she tonight, he asked, and shut up his mind against the question. He was to know that it was precisely that panic-stricken telegram and nothing else which had brought Betty Harlow's plans crashing about her ears. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Anne Upcott's Story. Early the next morning, Hanaud rang up the Maison Grenelle and made his appointment for the afternoon. Jim accordingly spent the morning with Monsieur Bex, who was quite overwhelmed with the story which was told to him. "Prisoners have their rights nowadays," he said. "They can claim the presence of their legal adviser when they are being examined by the judge. I will go round at once to the prefecture." With his head erect and his little chest puffed out like a bantam cock, he hurried to do battle for his client. There was no battle to be waged, however. Certainly Monsieur Bex's unhappy client was for the moment au secret. She would not come before the judge for a couple of days. It was the turn of Francine Royard. Every opportunity was to be given to the defense, and Monsieur Bex would certainly be granted an interview with Betty Harlow, if she so wished, before she was brought up in the judge's office. Monsieur Bex returned to the Place Etienne Dolet to find Jim Frobisher restlessly pacing his office. Jim looked up eagerly, but Monsieur Bex had no words of comfort. "I don't like it," he cried. "It displeases me. I'm not happy. They are all very polite, yes, but they examine the maid first. That's bad. I tell you," and he tapped upon the table, "that is Hanaud. He knows his affair. The servants, they can be made to talk, and this Francine Royard," he shook his head, "I shall get the best advocate in France." Jim left him to do his work and returned to the Maison Grenelle. It was obvious that nothing of these new and terrible developments of the affaire Warbesky had yet leaked out. There was not a whisper of it in the streets, not a loiterer about the gates of the Maison Grenelle. The affaire Warbesky had, in the general view, become a stale joke. Jim sent up word to Anne Upcott in her room that he was removing his luggage to the hotel in the Place d'Arcy, and leaving the house to her, where he prayed her to remain. Even at that moment Anne's lips twitched a little with humor as she read the embarrassed note. "He is very correct, as Monsieur Bex would say," she reflected, "and proper enough to make every nerve of Monsieur Hanaud thrill with delight." Jim returned in the afternoon, and once more in the shade of the sycamores, whilst the sunlight dappled the lawn and the bees hummed among the roses, Anne Upcott told a story of terror and darkness, though to a smaller audience. Certain additions were made to the story by Hanaud. "I should never have dreamed of going to Madame Lavey's ball," she began, "except for the anonymous letter," and Hanaud leaned forward alertly. The anonymous letter had arrived whilst she, Betty, and Jim Frobisher were sitting at dinner. It had been posted, therefore, in the middle of the day, and very soon after Anne had told her first story in the garden. Anne opened the envelope expecting a bill, and was amazed and a little terrified to read the signature, "The Scourge." She was more annoyed than ever when she read the contents, but her terror had decreased. The Scourge bade her attend the ball. He gave her explicit instructions that she should leave the ballroom at 10:30, follow a particular corridor leading to a wing away from the reception rooms, and hide behind the curtains in a small library. If she kept very still, she would overhear in a little while the truth about the death of Mrs. Harlowe. She was warned to tell no one of her plan. "I told no one then," Anne declared. "I thought the letter just a malicious joke, quite in accord with the Scourge's character. I put it back into its envelope, but I couldn't forget it. Suppose that by any chance there was something in it, and I didn't go. Why should the Scourge play a trick on me, who had no money and was of no importance? And all the while the sort of hope which no amount of reasoning can crush kept growing and growing." After dinner, Anne took the letter up to her sitting-room and believed it, and scorned herself for believing it, and believed it again. That afternoon she had almost felt the handcuffs on her wrists. There was no chance which she ought to refuse of clearing herself from suspicion, however wild it seemed. Anne made up her mind to consult Betty, and ran down to the treasure-room, which was lit up but empty. It was 9:30. Anne determined to wait for Betty's return, and was once more perplexed by the low position of the clock upon the marquetry cabinet. She stood in front of it, staring at it. She took her own watch in her hand, with a sort of vague idea that it might help her, and indeed it was very likely to. Had she turned its dial to the mirror behind the clock, the truth would have leapt at her, but she had not the time. For a slight movement in the room behind her arrested her attention. She turned abruptly. The room was empty, yet without doubt it was from within the room that the faint noise had come. And there was only one place from which it could have come. Someone was hiding within the elaborate sedan chair, with its shining gray panels, its delicate gold beading. Anne was uneasy rather than frightened. Her first thought was to ring the bell by the fireplace. She could do that well out of view of the sedan chair, and carry on until Gaston answered it. There were treasures enough in the room to repay 100 thieves. Then, without arguing at all, she took the bolder line. She went quietly towards the chair, advancing from the back, and then, with a rush, planted herself in front of the glass doors. She started back with a cry of surprise. The rail in front of the doors was down, the doors were open, and leaning back upon the billowy cushions sat Betty Harlowe. She sat quite still as an image even after Anne had appeared and uttered a cry of surprise. But she was not asleep. Her great eyes were blazing steadily out of the darkness of the chair in a way which gave Anne a curious shock. "I have been watching you," said Betty very slowly, and if ever there had been a chance that she would relent, that chance was gone forever now. She had come up out of the secret passage to find Anne playing with her watch in front of the mirror, seeking for an explanation of the doubt which troubled her, and so near to it, so very near to it. Anne heard her own death sentence pronounced in those words, "I have been watching you." And though she did not understand the menace they conveyed, there was something in the slow, steady utterance of them which a little unnerved her. "Betty," she cried, "I want your advice." Betty came out of the chair and took the anonymous letter from her hand. "Ought I to go?" Anne Upcott asked. "It's your affair," Betty replied. "In your place, I shouldn't hesitate. No one knows yet that there's any suspicion upon you." Anne put forward her objection. To go from this house of mourning might appear an outrage. "You're not a relation," Betty argued. "You can go privately, just before the time. I have no doubt we can arrange it all. But, of course, it's your affair." "Why should the scourge help me?" "I don't suppose that he is, except indirectly," Betty reasoned. "I imagine that he's attacking other people and using you." She read through the letter again. "He has always been right, hasn't he? That's what would determine me in your place, but I don't want to interfere." Anne spun round on her heel. "Very well, I shall go." "Then I should destroy that letter," and she made as if to tear it. "No," cried Anne, and she held out her hand for it. "I don't know Madame Lavey's house very well. I might easily lose my way without the instructions. I must take it with me." Betty agreed and handed the letter back. "You want to go quite quietly," she said, and she threw herself heart and soul into the necessary arrangements. She would give Francine Rollard a holiday and herself help Anne to dress in her fanciful and glistening frock. She wrote a letter to Michel Lavey, Madame Lavey's second son, and one of Betty's most indefatigable courtiers. Fortunately for himself, Michel Lavey kept that letter, and it saved him from any charge of complicity in her plot. For Betty used to him the same argument which had persuaded Jim Frobisher. She wrote frankly that suspicion had centered upon Anne Upcott, and that it was necessary that she should get away secretly. "All the plans have been made, Michel," she wrote. "Anne will come late. She is to meet the friends who will help her. It is best that you should know as little as possible about them in the little library. If you will keep the corridor clear for a little while, they can get out by the library doors into the park and be in Paris the next morning." She sealed up this letter without showing it to Anne and said, "I will send this by a messenger tomorrow morning, with orders to deliver it into Michel's own hands. Now, how are you to go?" Over that point the two girls had some discussion. It would be inviting Hanaud's interference if the big limousine were ordered out. What more likely than that he should imagine Anne meant to run away, and that Betty was helping her? That plan certainly would not do. "I know," Betty cried. "Jean Leclerc shall call for you. You will be ready to slip out. She will stop her car for a second outside the gates. It will be quite dark. You'll be away in a flash." "Jean Leclerc!" Anne exclaimed, drawing back. It had always perplexed Anne that Betty, so exquisite and fastidious in her own looks and bearing, should have found her friends amongst the flamboyant and the cheap. But she would rather throne it amongst her inferiors than take her place amongst her equals. Under her reserved demeanor, she was insatiable of recognition. The desire to be courted, admired, looked up to as a leader and a chief, burned within her like a raging flame. Jean Leclerc was of her company of satellites, a big red-haired woman of excessive manners, not without good looks of a kind, and certainly received in the society of the town. Anne Upcott not merely disliked, but distrusted her. She had a feeling that there was something indefinably wrong in her very nature. "She will do anything for me, Anne," said Betty. "That's why I named her. I know that she is going to Madame Lavey's dance." Anne Upcott gave in, and a second letter was written to Jean Leclerc. This second letter asked Jean to call at the Maison Grenelle at an early hour in the morning, and Jean Leclerc came and was closeted with Betty for an hour between 9 and 10. Thus all the arrangements were made. It was at this point that Frobisher interrupted Hanaud's explanations. "No," he said, "there remains Espinosa and the young brother to be accounted for." "Mademoiselle has just told us that she heard a slight noise in the treasure-room and found Betty Harlow seated in the sedan chair," Hanaud replied. Betty Harlow had just returned from the Hôtel de Brabazar, whither Espinosa went that night after it had grown dark and about the time when dinner was over in the Maison Grenelle. From the Hôtel de Brabazar, Espinosa went to the Rue Gambetta and waited for Jean Cladel. It was a busy night, that one, my friends. That old wolf, the law, was sniffing at the bottom of the door. They could hear him, They had no time to waste. The next night came. Dinner was very late, Jim remembered. It was because Betty was helping Anne to dress, Francine having been given her holiday. Jim and Betty dined alone, and whilst they dined, Anne Upcott stole downstairs, a cloak of white ermine hiding her pretty dress. She held the front door a little open, and the moment Jean Leclerc's car stopped before the gates, she flashed across the courtyard. Jean had the door of her car open. It had hardly stopped before it went on again. Jim, as the story was told, remembered vividly Betty's preoccupation whilst dinner went on, and the immensity of her relief when the hall door so gently closed and the car moved forward out of the street of Charles Robert. Anne Upcott had gone for good from the Maison Grenelle. She would not interfere with Betty Harlow any more. Jean Leclerc and Anne Upcott reached Madame Leveille's house a few minutes after 10. Michel Leveille came forward to meet them. "I'm so glad that you came, mademoiselle," he said to Anne. "But you are late. Madame, my mother, has left her place at the door of the ballroom, but we shall find her later." He took them to the cloakroom, and coming away, they were joined by Espinosa. "You are going to dance now?" Michel Leveille asked. "No, not yet." "Then Signor Espinosa will take you to the buffet while I look after others of our guests." He hurried away towards the ballroom, where a clatter of high voices competed with the music of the band. Espinosa conducted the two ladies to the buffet. There was hardly anybody in the room. "We are still too early," said Jean Leclerc in a low voice. "We shall take some coffee." But Anne would not. Her eyes were on the door, her feet danced, her hands could not keep still. Was the letter a trick? Would she, indeed, within the next few minutes, learn the truth? At one moment her heart sank into her shoes, at another it soared. "Mademoiselle, you neglect your coffee," said Espinosa urgently, "and it is good." "No doubt," Anne replied. She turned to Jean Leclerc. "You will send me home, won't you? I shall not wait afterwards." "But of course," Jean Leclerc replied. "All that is arranged. The chauffeur has his orders. You will take your coffee, dear?" Again Anne would not. "I want nothing," she declared. "It is time that I went." She caught a swift and curious interchange of glances between Jean Leclerc and Espinosa, but she was in no mood to seek an interpretation. There could be no doubt that the coffee set before her had had some drug slipped into it by Espinosa when he fetched it from the buffet to the little table at which they sat. A drug which would have half stupefied her and made her easy to manage. But she was not to be persuaded, and she rose to her feet. "I shall get my cloak," she said, and she fetched it, leaving her two companions together. She did not return to the buffet. On the far side of the big central hall, a long corridor stretched out. At the mouth of the corridor, guarding it, stood Michel Leveille. He made a sign to her, and when she joined him, "Turn down to the right into the wing," he said in a low voice. "The small library is in front of you." Anne slipped past him. She turned into a wing of the house which was quite deserted and silent. At the end of it a shut door confronted her. She opened it softly. It was all dark within, but enough light entered from the corridor to show her the high bookcases ranged against the walls, the position of the furniture, and some dark, heavy curtains at the end. She was the first, then, to come to the tryst. She closed the door behind her and moved slowly and cautiously forwards with her hands outstretched until she felt the curtains yield. She passed in between them into the recess of a great bow window opening onto the park, and a sound, a strange creaking sound, brought her heart into her mouth. Someone was already in the room, then. Somebody had been quietly watching as she came in from the lighted corridor. The sound grew louder. Anne peered between the curtains, holding them apart with shaking hands, and through that chink from behind her a vague twilight flowed into the room. In the far corner, near to the door, high up on a tall bookcase, something was clinging. Something was climbing down. Whoever it was had been hiding behind the ornamental top of the heavy mahogany bookcase, was now using the shelves like the rungs of a ladder. Anne was seized with a panic. A sob broke from her throat. She ran for the door, but she was too late. A black figure dropped from the bookcase to the ground, and as Anne reached out her hands to the door, a scarf was whipped about her mouth, stifling her cry. She was jerked back into the room, but her fingers had touched the light switch by the door, and as she stumbled and fell, the room was lighted up. Her assailant fell upon her, driving the breath out of her lungs, and knotted the scarf tightly at the back of her head. Anne tried to lift herself, and recognized with a gasp of amazement that the assailant who pinned her down by the weight of her body and the thrust of her knees was Francine Roulard. Her panic gave place to anger and a burning humiliation. She fought with all the strength of her supple body, but the scarf about her mouth stifled and weakened her, and with a growing dismay she understood that she was no match for the hardy peasant girl. She was the taller of the two, but her height did not avail her. She was like a child matched with a wildcat. Francine's hands were made of steel. She snatched Anne's arms behind her back and bound her wrists as she lay face downwards, her bosom laboring, her heart racing so that she felt that it must burst. Then, as Anne gave up the contest, she turned and tied her by the ankles. Francine was upon her feet again in a flash. She ran to the door, opened it a little way, and beckoned. Then she dragged her prisoner up onto a couch, and Jean Leclerc and Espinosa slipped into the room. "It's done?" said Espinosa. Francine laughed. "Ah, but she fought, the pretty baby. You should have given her the coffee. Then she would have walked with us. Now she must be carried. She's wicked, I can tell you." Jean Leclerc twisted a lace scarf about the girl's face to hide the gag over her mouth, and while Francine held her up, set her white cloak about her shoulders and fastened it in front. Espinosa then turned out the light and drew back the curtains. The room was at the back of the house. In the front of the window, the park stretched away, but it was the park of a French chateau, where the cattle feed up to the windows, and only a strip about the front terrace is devoted to pleasure gardens and fine lawns. Espinosa looked out upon a meadowland thickly studded with trees, and cows dimly moving in the dusk of the summer night like ghosts. He opened the window, and the throb of the music from the ballroom came faintly to their ears. "We must be quick," said Espinosa. He lifted the helpless girl in his arms and passed out into the park. They held the window open behind them, and between them they carried their prisoner across the grass, keeping where it was possible in the gloom of the trees, and aiming for a point in the drive where a motor car waited halfway between the house and the gates. A blur of light from the terrace and ornamental grounds in front of it became visible away upon their left, but here all was dark. Once or twice they stopped and set Anne upon her feet, and held her so while they rested. "A few more yards," Espinosa whispered, and stifling an oath, he stopped again. They were on the edge of the drive now, and just ahead of him he saw the glimmer of a white dress, and close to it the glow of a cigarette. Swiftly he put Anne down again, and propped her against a tree. Jean Leclerc stood in front of her, and as the truants from the ballroom approached, she began to talk to Anne, nodding her head like one engrossed in a lively story. Espinosa's heart stood still as he heard the man say, "Why, there are some others here. That is curious. Shall we see?" But even as he moved across the drive, the girl in the white dress caught him by the arm. "That would not be very tactful," she said with a laugh. "Let us do as we would be done by." And the couple sauntered past. Espinosa waited until they had disappeared. "Quick, let us go," he whispered in a shaking voice. A few yards further on, they found Espinosa's closed car hidden in a little alley which led from the main drive. They placed Anne in the car. Jean Leclerc got in beside her, and Espinosa took the wheel. As they took the road to the Val Thedon, a distant clock struck 11. Within the car, Jean Leclerc removed the gag from Anne Upcott's mouth, drew the sack over her head, and fastened it underneath her feet. At the branch road, young Espinosa was waiting with his motorcycle and sidecar. "I can add a few words to that story, mademoiselle," said Hanaud when she had ended. "First, Michel Levet went later into the library and bolted the window again, believing you to be well upon your way to Paris. Second, Espinosa and Jean Leclerc were taken as they returned to Madame Leveille's ball. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, The Night of the 27th. We are not yet quite at the end, said Hanaud, as he sat with Frobisher for a while upon the lawn after Anne Upcott had gone in. But we are near to it. There is still my question to be answered. Why was the communicating door open between the bedroom of Madame Harlowe and the treasure room on the night when Anne Upcott came down the stairs in the dark? When we know that, we shall know why Francine Rollard and Betty Harlowe between them murdered Madame Harlowe. Then you believe Francine Rollard had a hand in that crime too? Asked Jim. I am sure, returned Hanaud. Do you remember the experiment I made, the little scene of reconstruction? Betty Harlowe stretched out upon the bed to represent Madame, and Francine whispering, "That will do now?" Yes. Hanaud lit a cigarette and smiled. Francine Rollard would not stand at the side of the bed. No, she would stand at the foot and whisper those simple but appalling words, but nowhere else. That was significant, my friend. She would not stand directly where she had stood when the murder was committed. He added softly, I have great hopes of Francine Rollard. A few days of a prison cell and that untamed little tiger cat will talk. And what of Wabersky in all this? Jim exclaimed. Hanaud laughed and rose from his chair. Wabersky? He is for nothing in all this. He brought a charge in which he didn't believe, and the charge happened to be true. That is all. He took a step or two away and returned. But I am wrong. That is not all. Wabersky is indeed for something in all this, for when he was pressed to make good his charge and must rake up some excuse for it somehow, by a piece of luck he thinks of a morning when he saw Betty Harlowe in the street of Gambetta near to the shop of Jean Cladel, and so he leads us to the truth. Yes, we owe something to that animal, Boris Wabersky. Did I not tell you, monsieur, that we are all the servants of chance? Hanaud went from the garden, and for 3 days Jim Frobisher saw him no more. But the development which Monsieur Bex feared, and for which Hanaud hoped, took place, and on the 3rd day Hanaud invited Jim to his office in the Préfecture. He had Jim's memorandum in his hand. Do you remember what you wrote? He asked. See? He pushed the memorandum in front of Jim and pointed to a paragraph. But in the absence of any trace of poison in the dead woman's body, it is difficult to see how the criminal can be brought to justice, except by A, confession, B, the commission of another crime of a similar kind. Hanaud's theory, once a poisoner, always a poisoner. Frobisher read it through. Now, that is very true, said Hanaud. Never have I come across a case more difficult. At every step we break down. I think I have my fingers on Jean Cladel. I am 5 minutes too late. I think that I shall get some useful evidence from a firm in Paris. The firm has ceased to be for the last 10 years. All the time I strike at air. So I must take a risk. Yes, and a serious one. Shall I tell you what that risk was? I have to assume that Mademoiselle Anne will be brought alive to the Hôtel de Barbazet on the night of Madame Leveille's ball. That she would be brought back, I had no doubt. For one thing, there could be no safer resting place for her than under the stone flags of the kitchen there. For another, there was the portmanteau in the side car. It was not light, the portmanteau. Some friends of mine watched it being put into the side car before young Espinosa started for his rendezvous. I have no doubt it weighed just as many kilos as Mademoiselle Anne. I never understood the reason for that portmanteau, Frobisher interrupted. It was a matter of timing. There were 25 kilometers of a bad track, with many sharp little twists between Val d'Azan and the Hôtel de Barbazan. And a motorcycle with an empty sidecar would take appreciably longer to cover the distance than a cycle with a sidecar weighted, which could take the corners at its top speed. They were anxious to get the exact time the journey would take with an Upcott in the sidecar, so that there might be no needless hanging about waiting for its arrival. But they were a little too careful. Our friend Boris said a shrewd thing, didn't he? Some crimes are discovered because the alibis are too unnaturally perfect. Oh, there was no doubt they meant to bring back Mademoiselle Anne, but suppose they brought her back dead? It wasn't likely, no. It would be much easier to finish her off with a dose of the arrow poison. No struggle, no blood, no trouble at all. I reckoned that they would dope her at Madame Leveille's ball and bring her back half-conscious, as indeed they meant to do. But I shivered all that evening at the risk I had taken, and when that cycle shut off its engine, as we stood in the darkness of the gallery, I was in despair. He shook his shoulders uncomfortably, as though the danger was not yet past. Anyway, I took the risk, he resumed, and so we got fulfilled your condition B, the commission, or in this case the attempted commission, of another crime of the same kind. Frobisher nodded. But now, said Hanaud, leaning forward, we have got your condition A fulfilled, a confession, a clear and complete confession from Francine Roulard, and so many admissions from the Espinosas and Jean Leclerc and Maurice Thévenet that they amount to confessions. We have put them all together, and here is the new part of the case with which Monsieur Bex and you will have to deal. The charge not of murder attempted, but of murder committed, the murder of Madame Harlowe. Jim Frobisher was upon the point of interrupting, but he thought better of it. Go on, he contented himself with saying. Why Betty Harlowe took to writing anonymous letters, monsieur, who shall say? The dullness of life for a girl, young and beautiful and passionate, in a provincial town, as our friend Boris suggests, the craving for excitement, something bad and vicious and abnormal born in her, part of her, and craving more and more expression as she grew in years, the exacting attendance upon Madame. Probably all of these elements combined to suggest the notion to her, and suddenly it became easy for her. She discovered a bill in that box in Madame Harlowe's bedroom, a receipted bill 10 years old from the firm of Chaperon, builders of the Rue de Batignolles in Paris. You, by the way, saw an unburnt fragment of the bill in the ashes upon the hearth of the treasure-room. This bill disclosed to her the existence of the hidden passage between the treasure-room and the Hôtel de Brabançon, for it was the bill of the builders who had repaired it at the order of Simon Harlowe. An old typewriting machine belonging to Simon Harlowe and the absolute privacy of the Hôtel de Brabançon made the game easy and safe, but as the opportunity grew, so did the desire. Betty Harlowe tasted power. She took one or two people into her confidence, her maid Francine, Maurice Thévenet, Jean Leclerc, and Jean Claudel, a very useful personage. And once started, the circle grew. Blackmail followed. Blackmail of Betty Harlowe, you understand. She, the little queen, became the big slave. She must provide Thévenet with his mistress, Espinosa with his car and his house, Jean Leclerc with her luxuries. So the anonymous letters become themselves blackmailing letters. Maurice Thévenet knows the police side of Dijon and the province. Jean Leclerc has a friend, shall we say, in the director of an insurance company, and believe me, for a blackmailer, nothing is more important than to know accurately the financial resources of one's, let us say, clients. Thus the game went merrily on until money was wanted, and it couldn't be raised. Betty Harlowe looked around Dijon. There was no one for the moment to exploit. Yes, one person. Let us do Betty Harlowe the justice to believe that the suggestion came from that promising young novice, Maurice Thévenet. Who was that person, Monsieur Frobisher? Even now Jim Frobisher was unable to guess the truth, led up to it though he had been by Hanaud's exposition. Why, Madame Harlowe herself, Hanaud explained, and as Jim Frobisher started back in a horror of disbelief, he continued, Yes, it is so. Madame Harlowe received a letter at dinner-time, just as Anne Upcott did, on the night of Monsieur de Pauillac's ball. She took her dinner in bed, you remember that night. That letter was shown to Jean Baudin, the nurse, who remembers it very well. It demanded a large sum of money, and something was said about a number of passionate letters which Madame Harlowe might not care to have published. Not too much, you understand, but enough to make it clear that the liaison of Madame Ravière and Simon Harlowe was not a secret from the scourge. I'll tell you something else which will astonish you, Monsieur Frobisher. That letter was shown not only to Jean Baudin, but to Betty Harlowe herself, when she came to say good night and show herself in her new dance frock of silver tissue and her silver slippers. It was no wonder that Betty Harlowe lost her head a little when I set my little trap for her in the library, and pretended that I did not want to read what Madame had said to Jean Baudin after Betty Harlowe had gone off to her ball. I hadn't one idea what a very unpleasant little trap it was. But wait a moment, Frobisher interrupted. If Madame Harlowe showed this letter first of all to Jean Baudin, and afterward to Betty Harlowe in Jean Baudin's presence, why didn't Jean Baudin speak of it at once to the examining magistrate when Wabersky brought his accusation? She kept silent. Yes, she kept silent. Why shouldn't she? Returned Hanaud. Jean Baudin is a good and decent girl. For her, Madame Harlowe had died a natural death in her sleep, the very form in which death might be expected to come for her. Jean Baudin didn't believe a word of Wabersky's accusation. Why should she rake up old scandals? She herself proposed to Betty Harlowe to say nothing about the anonymous letter. Jim Frobisher thought over the argument and accepted it. Yes, I see her point of view, he admitted, and Hanaud continued his narrative. Well, then, Betty Harlowe is off to her ball on the Boulevard Thiers. Anne Upcott is in her sitting-room. Jean Baudin has finished her offices for the night. Madame Harlowe is alone. What does she do? Drink? For that night, no. She sits and thinks. Were there any of the letters which passed between her and Simon Harlowe before she was Simon Harlowe's wife still existing? She had thought to have destroyed them all, but she was a woman. She might have clutched some back. If there were any, where would they be? Why, in that house at the end of the secret passage. Some such thoughts must have passed through her mind, for she rose from her bed, slipped on her dressing-gown and shoes, unlocked the communicating door between her and the treasure-room, and passed by the secret way into the empty Hôtel de Bras-Bizarre. And what does she find there, monsieur? A room in daily use, a bundle of her letters ready in the top drawer of her Empire writing-table, and on the writing-table Simon's Corona machine and the paper and envelopes of the anonymous letters. Monsieur, there is only one person who can have access to that room, the girl whom she has befriended, whom in her exacting way she no doubt loved. And at 11 o'clock that night, Francine Rollard is startled by the entrance of Madame Harlowe into her bedroom. For a moment Francine fancied that Madame had been drinking. She was very quickly better informed. She was told to get up, to watch for Betty Harlowe's return, and to bring her immediately to Madame Harlowe's bedroom. At 1 o'clock, Francine Rollard is waiting in the dark hall. As Betty comes in from her party, Francine Rollard gives her the message. Neither of these two girls know as yet how much of their villainies has been discovered, but something, at all events. Betty Harlowe bade Francine wait and ran upstairs silently to her room. Betty Harlowe was prepared against discovery. She had been playing with fire, and she didn't mean to be burnt. She had the arrow poison ready. Yes, ready for herself. She filled her hypodermic needle, and with that concealed in the palm of her glove, she went to confront her benefactress. You can imagine that scene. The outraged woman, whose romance and tragedy were to be exploited, blurting out her fury in front of Francine Rollard. It wasn't Wabersky who was to be stripped to the skin. No, but the girl in the pretty silver frock and the silver slippers. You can imagine the girl, too, her purpose changing under the torrent of abuse. Why should she use the arrow poison to destroy herself when she can save everything, fortune, liberty, position, by murder? Only she must be quick. Madame's voice is rising in gusts of violence. Even in that house of the old thick walls, Jean Bodin, someone, might be awakened by the clamor. And in a moment the brutal thing is done. Madame Harlowe is flung back upon her bed. Her mouth is covered and held by Francine Roulard. The needle does its work. "That will do now," whispers Betty Harlowe. But at the door of the treasure room in the darkness, Anne Upcott is standing, unable to identify the voice which whispered, just as you and I were unable, monsieur, to identify a voice which whispered to us from the window of Jean Claudel's house, but taking deep into her memory the terrible words, and neither of the murderesses knew it. They go calmly about their search for the letters. They cannot find them, because Madame had pushed them into the coffer of old bills and papers. They rearrange the bed, they compose their victim in it as if she were asleep, they pass into the treasure room, and they forget to lock the door behind them. Very likely they visit the Hôtel de Barbizard. Betty Harlowe has the rest of the arrow poison and the needle to put in some safe place, and where else is safe? In the end, when every care has been taken that not a scrap of incriminating evidence is left to shout murder the next morning, Betty creeps up the stairs to make sure that Anne Upcott is asleep, and Anne Upcott, waking, stretches up her hands and touches her face. "That, monsieur," and Hanaud rose to his feet, "is what you would call the case of the Crown. It is the case which you and Monsieur Bex have to meet." Jim Frobisher made up his mind to say the things which he had almost said at the beginning of this interview. "I will tell Monsieur Bex exactly what you have told me. I shall give him every assistance that I personally or my firm can give. But I have no longer any formal connection with the defense." Hanaud looked at Frobisher in perplexity. "I don't understand, monsieur. This is not the moment to renounce a client." "Nor do I," returned Frobisher. "It is the other way about. Monsieur Bex put it to me how shall I say?" Hanaud supplied the missing word with a twitch of his lips. "Very correctly?" "He told me that mademoiselle did not wish to see me again." Hanaud walked over to the window. The humiliation evident in Frobisher's voice and face moved him. He said very gently, "I can understand that, can't you? She has fought for a great stake all this last week, her liberty, her fortune, her good name. And you—" "Oh, yes," he continued, as Jim stirred at the table. "Let us be frank. And you, monsieur, you were a little different from her friends. From the earliest moment she set her passion upon you. Do you remember the first morning I came to the Maison Grenelle? You promised Anne Upcott to put up there, though you had just refused the same invitation from Betty Harlowe. Such a fury of jealousy blazed in her eyes that I had to drop my stick with a clatter in the hall, lest she should recognize that I could not but have discovered her secret. Well, having fought for this stake and lost, she would not wish to see you. You had seen her, too, in her handcuffs, and tied by the legs like a sheep. I understand her very well." Jim Frobisher remembered that from the moment Hanaud burst into the room at the Hôtel de Barbizard, Betty had never once even looked at him. He got up from his chair and took up his hat and stick. "I must go back to my partner in London with this story as soon as I have told it to Monsieur Bex," he said. "I should like it complete. When did you first suspect Betty Harlowe?" Hanaud nodded. "That, too, I shall tell you." "Oh, don't thank me. I am not so sure that I should be so ready with all of these confidences if I was not certain what the verdict in the assize court must be. I shall gather up for you the threads which are still loose, but not here." He looked at his watch. "See, it is past noon. We shall once more have Philippe Le Bon's terrace tower to ourselves. It may be, too, that we shall see Mont Blanc across all the leagues of France. Come, let us take your memorandum and go there." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. the Façade of Notre Dame. For a second time they were fortunate. It was a day without mist or clouds, and the towering silver ridge hung in the blue sky, distinct and magical. Hanaud lit one of his black cigarettes and reluctantly turned away from it. "There were two great mistakes made," he said. "One at the very beginning by Betty Harlow. One at the very end by me, and of the two, mine was the least excusable. Let us begin, therefore, at the beginning. Madame Harlow has died a natural death. She is buried. Betty Harlow inherits the Harlow fortune. Boris Wabersky asks her for money, and she snaps her fingers. Why should she not? Ah, but she must have been very sorry a week later that she snapped her the fingers, for suddenly he flings his bomb. Madame Harlow was poisoned by her niece Betty. Imagine Betty Harlow's feelings when she heard that. The charge is preposterous, no doubt, but it is also true. A minute back she is safe. Nothing can touch her. Now suddenly her head is loose upon her neck. She is frightened. She is questioned in the examining magistrate's room. The magistrate has nothing against her. All will be well if she does not make a slip. But there is a good chance she may make a slip, for she has done the murder. Her danger is not any evidence which Wabersky can bring, but just herself. In 2 days she is still more frightened, for she hears that Hanaud is called in from Paris. So she makes her mistake. She sends a telegram to you in London." "Why was that a mistake?" Frobisher asked quickly. "Because I began to ask myself at once, how does Betty Harlow know that Hanaud has been called in? Oh, to be sure, I made a great fluster in my office about the treachery of my colleagues in Dijon, but I did not believe a word of that. No, I am at once curious about Betty Harlow. That is all. Still, I am curious. Well, we come to Dijon, and you tell her that you have shown me that telegram." "Yes," Jim admitted, "I did. I remember, too," he added slowly, "that she put out her hand on the window-sill. Yes, as if to steady herself." "But she was quick to recover," returned Hanaud with a nod of appreciation. "She must account for that telegram. She cannot tell me that Maurice Thevenet sent a hurried word to her. No, so when I ask her if she has ever received one of these anonymous letters, which, remember, were my real business in Dijon, she says at once, 'Yes, I received one on the Sunday morning, which told me that Monsieur Hanaud was coming from Paris to make an end of me.' That was quick, eh? Yes, but I know it is a lie, for it was not until the Sunday evening that any question of my being sent for arose at all. You see, Mademoiselle Betty was in a corner. I had asked her for the letter. She does not say that she has destroyed it, lest I should at once believe that she never received any such letter at all. On the contrary, she says that it is in the treasure room, which is sealed up, knowing quite well that she can write it and place it there by way of the Hôtel de Brabançon before the seals are removed. But for the letter to be in the treasure room, she must have received it on the Sunday morning, since it was on the Sunday morning that the seals were affixed. She did not know when it was first proposed to call me in. She draws a bow at a venture, and I know that she is lying, and I am more curious than ever about Betty Harlow." He stopped, for Jim Frobisher was staring at him with a look of horror in his eyes. "It was I, then, who put you on her track. I who came out to defend her," he cried, "for it was I who showed you the telegram." "Monsieur Frobisher, that would not have mattered if Betty Harlow had been, as you believed her, innocent," Hanaud replied gravely, and Frobisher was silent. "Well, then, after my first interview with Betty Harlow, I went over the house whilst you and Betty talked together in the library." "Yes," said Jim. "And in Mademoiselle Anne's sitting-room I found something which interested me at the first glance. Now tell me what it was." And he cocked his head at Jim with the hope that his riddle would divert him from his self-reproaches, and in that, to some extent, he succeeded. "That I can guess," Frobisher answered with a ghost of a smile. "It was the treatise on Strophanthus." "Yes, the arrow poison, the poison which leaves no trace. Monsieur, that poison has been my nightmare. Who would be the first poisoner to use it? How should I cope with him and prove that it brought no more security than arsenic or prussic acid? These are questions which have terrified me. And suddenly, unexpectedly, in a house where a death from heart failure has just occurred, I find a dry-as-dust treatise upon the poison tucked away under a pile of magazines in a young lady's sitting-room. I tell you, I was staggered. What was it doing there? How did it come there? I see a note upon the cover, indicating a page. I turn to the page, and there, staring at me, is an account of Simon Harlowe's perfect specimen of a poison arrow. The anonymous letters? They are at once forgotten. What if that animal Wabersky, without knowing it, were right, and Madame Harlowe was murdered in the Maison Ganel? I must find that out. I tuck the treatise up my back beneath my waistcoat, and I go downstairs again, asking myself some questions. Is Mademoiselle Anne interested in such matters as Strophanthus hispidus? Or had she anything to hope for from Madame Harlowe's death? Or did she perhaps not know at all that the treatise was under that pile of magazines upon the table at the side? I do not know, and my head is rather in a whirl. Then I catch that wicked look of Betty Harlowe at her friend. Monsieur, a revealing look. I have not the demure and simple young lady of convention to deal with at all. No, I go away from the Maison Ganel, still more curious about Betty Harlowe. Jim Frobisher sat quickly down at Hanaud's side. Are you sure of that? He asked suspiciously. Quite, Hanaud replied in wonder. You have forgotten, haven't you, that immediately after you left the Maison Ganel that day, you had the Sergent de Ville removed from its gates? No, I don't forget that at all, Hanaud answered imperturbably. The Sergent de Ville in his white trousers was an absurdity, worse than that, an actual hindrance. There is little use in watching people who know that they are being watched. So I removed the Sergent de Ville, and now I can begin really to watch those young ladies of the Maison Ganel. And that afternoon, whilst Monsieur Frobisher is removing his luggage from his hotel, Betty Harlowe goes out for a walk, is discreetly followed by Nicolas Moreau, and vanishes. I don't blame Nicolas. He must not press too close upon her heels. She was in that place of small lanes about the Hotel de Brabazar. No doubt it was through the little postern in the wall, which we ourselves used a few days afterwards, that she vanished. There was the anonymous letter to be written, ready for me to receive when the seals of the treasure room were broken. But I don't know that yet. No. All that I know is that Betty Harlowe goes out for a walk and is lost, and after an hour reappears in another street. Meanwhile, I pass my afternoon examining, so far as I can, how these young ladies pass their lives and who are their friends. An examination not very productive and not altogether futile, for I find some curious friends in Betty Harlowe's circle. Now, observe this, monsieur. Young girls with advanced ideas, social, political, literary, what you will. In their case, curious friends mean nothing. They are to be expected. But with a young girl who is to all appearances leading the normal life of her class, the case is different. In her case, curious friends are curious. The Espinozas, Maurice Thévenet, Jean Leclerc, flashy, cheap people of that type. How shall we account for them as friends of that delicate piece of china, Betty Harlowe? Jim Frobisher nodded his head. He, too, had been a trifle disconcerted by the familiarity between Espinoza and Betty Harlowe. The evening, Hanaud continued, which you spent so pleasantly in the cool of the garden with the young ladies, I spent with the Edinburgh professor, and I prepared a little trap. Yes, and the next morning I came early to the Maison Ganel, and I set my little trap. I replaced the book about the arrows on the bookshelf in its obvious place. Hanaud paused in his explanation to take another black cigarette from his eternal blue bundle and to offer one to Jim. Then comes our interview with the animal Wabersky, and he tells me that queer story about Betty Harlow in the street of Gambetta, close to the shop of Jean Claudel. He may be lying, he may be speaking the truth, and what he saw might be an accident. Yes, but also it fits in with this theory of Madame Harlow's murder which is now taking hold of me. For if that poison was used, then someone who understood the composition of drugs must have made the solution from the paste upon the arrow. I am more curious than ever about Betty Harlow, and the moment that animal has left me, I spring my trap, and I have a success beyond all my expectations. I point to the treatise of the Edinburgh professor. It was not in its place yesterday. It is today. Who, then, replaced it? I ask that question, and Mademoiselle Anne is utterly at sea. She knows nothing about that book. That is evident as Mont Blanc over there in the sky. On the other hand, Betty Harlow knows at once who has replaced that book, and in a most unwise moment of sarcasm, she allows me to see that she knows. She knows that I found it yesterday, that I have studied it since and replaced it, and she is not surprised. No, for she knows where I found it. I am at once like Wabersky. I know it in my heart that she put it under those magazines in Anne Upcott's room, although I do not yet know it in my head. Betty Harlow had prepared to divert suspicion from herself upon Anne Upcott, should suspicion arise. But innocent people do not do that, monsieur. Then we go into the garden, and Mademoiselle Anne tells us her story. Monsieur Frobisher, I said to you immediately afterwards that all great criminals who are women are great actresses, but never in my life have I seen one who acted so superbly as Betty Harlow, while that story was being unfolded. Imagine it! A cruel murder has been secretly committed, and suddenly the murderess has to listen to a true account of that murder in the presence of the detective who is there to fix the guilt. There was someone at hand all the time, almost an eyewitness, perhaps an actual eyewitness, for she cannot know that she is safe until the last word of the story is told. Picture to yourself Betty Harlow's feelings during that hour in the pleasant garden, if you can. The questions which must have been racing through her mind. Did Anne Upcott in the end creep forward and peer through the lighted doorway? Does she know the truth, and has she kept it hidden until this moment when Hanaud and Frobisher are present and she can speak it safely? Will her next words be, "And here at my side sits the murderess"? These must have been terrible moments for Betty Harlow. Yet she gave no sign of any distress, Frobisher added. But she took a precaution, Hanaud remarked. She ran suddenly and very swiftly into the house. Yes, you seemed to me on the point of stopping her. And I was, continued Hanaud, but I let her go, and she returned. With the photographs of Mrs. Harlow, Frobisher interrupted. Oh, with more than those photographs, Hanaud exclaimed. She turned her chair towards Mademoiselle Anne. She sat with her handkerchief in her hand and her face against her handkerchief, listening, the tender, sympathetic friend. But when Mademoiselle Anne told us that the hour of the murder was 10:30, a weakness overtook her, could not but overtake her, and in that moment of weakness she dropped her handkerchief. Oh, she picked it up again at once. Yes, but where the handkerchief had fallen, her foot now rested, and when the story was all ended, and we got up from our chairs, she spun round upon her heel with a certain violence, so that there was left a hole in that well-watered turf. I was anxious to discover what it was that she had brought out from the house in her handkerchief, and had dropped with her handkerchief, and had driven with all the weight of her body into the turf, so that no one might see it. In fact, I left my gloves behind in order that I might come back and discover it. But she was too quick for me. She fetched my gloves herself, much to my shame that I, Hanaud, should be waited on by so exquisite a young lady. However, I found it afterwards when you and Giraudeau and the others were all waiting for me in the library. It was that tablet of cyanide of potassium which I showed to you in the Préfecture. She did not know how much Anne Upcott was going to reveal. The arrow poison had been hidden away in the Hôtel de Brabazar, but she had something else at hand, more rapid, death like a thunderbolt. So she ran into the house for it. I tell you, monsieur, it wanted nerve to sit there with that tablet close to her mouth. She grew very pale. I do not wonder. What I do wonder is that she did not topple straight off her chair in a dead faint before us all. But no, she sat ready to swallow that tablet at once if there were need, before my hand could stop her. Once more I say to you, people who are innocent do not do that. Jim had no argument wherewith to answer. Yes, he was forced to admit, she could have got the tablets, no doubt, from Jean Claudel. Very well, then, Hanaud resumed. We have separated for luncheon, and in the afternoon the seals are to be removed. Before that takes place, certain things must be done. The clock must be moved from the mantel-shelf in the treasure-room on to the marquetry cabinet. Some letters, too, must be burnt. Yes, why? Frobisher asked eagerly. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. The letters were burned. It is difficult to say. For my part, I think those old letters between Simon Harlowe and Madame Rabiat alluded too often to the secret passage. But here I am guessing. What I learnt for certain during that luncheon hour is that there is a secret passage, and that it runs from the treasure-room to the Hôtel de Brabazar. For this time Nicolas Marot makes no mistake. He follows her to the Hôtel de Brabazar, and I, from this tower, see the smoke rising from the chimney. Look, monsieur, there it is, but no smoke rises from it today. He rose to his feet and turned his back upon Mont Blanc. The trees in the garden, the steep yellow-patterned roof, and the chimneys of the Maison Grenelle stood out above the lesser buildings which surrounded them. Only from one of the chimneys did the smoke rise today, and that one at the extreme end of the building, where the kitchens were. We are back, then, in the afternoon. The seals are removed, we are in Madame Harlowe's bedroom, and something I cannot explain occurs. The disappearance of the necklace, Frobisher exclaimed confidently, and Hanaud grinned joyfully. See, I set a trap for you, and at once you were caught, he cried. The necklace? Oh, no, I am prepared for that. The guilt is being transferred to Mademoiselle Anne. Good. But it is not enough to hide the book about the arrow in her room. No, we must provide her also with a motive. Mademoiselle is poor. Mademoiselle inherits nothing. Therefore, the necklace worth 100,000 pounds vanishes, and you must draw from its vanishing what conclusion you will. No, the little matter I cannot explain is different. Betty Harlowe and our friend Giraudeau pay a visit to Jean Baudin's bedroom to make sure that a cry from Madame's room could not be heard there. Yes. Our good Giraudeau comes back. Yes. But he comes alone. That is the little thing I cannot explain. Where is Betty Harlowe? I ask for her before I go into the treasure-room, and lo, very modestly and quietly, she has slipped in amongst us again. I am very curious about that, my friend, and I keep my eyes open for an explanation, I assure you. I remember, said Frobisher, you stopped with your hand upon the door and asked for Mademoiselle Harlowe. I wondered why you stopped. I attached no importance to her absence. Hanaud flourished his hand. He was happy. He was in the artist's mood. The work was over, the long strain and pain of it. Now let those outside admire. Of all that the treasure-room had to tell us, you know, Monsieur Frobisher, but I answer a question in your memorandum. The instant I am in that room, I look for the mouth of that secret passage from the Hôtel de Brabazar. At once I see. There is only one place, the elegant sedan chair framed so prettily in a recess of the wall. So I am very careful not to pry amongst its cushions for the poison arrow, just as I am very careful not to ask for the envelope with the postmark in which the anonymous letter was sent. If Betty Harlowe thinks that she has overreached the old fox Hanaud, good. Let her think so. So we go upstairs, and I find the explanation of that little matter of Betty Harlowe's absence which has been so troubling me. Jim Frobisher stared at him. "No," he said, "I haven't got that. We went into Anne Upcott's sitting room. I write my memorandum with the shaft of the poisoned arrow, and you notice it. Yes, but the matter of Betty Harlow's absence? No, I haven't got that." "But you have," cried Hanaud. "That pen. It was not there in the pen tray on the day before, when I found the book. There was just one pen, the foolish thing young ladies use, a great goose quill dyed red, and nothing else. The arrow shaft had been placed there since. When? Why, just now. It is clear, that. Where was that shaft of the poisoned arrow before? In one of two places, either in the treasure room or in the Hôtel de Brabançon. Betty Harlow has fetched it away during that hour of freedom. She carries it in her dress. She seizes her moment when we are all in Madame Harlow's bedroom, and there it is, in the pen tray of Mademoiselle Anne, to make suspicion still more convincing. Monsieur, I walk away with Monsieur Bex, who has some admirable scheme that I should search the gutters for a matchbox full of pearls. I agree. Oh, yes, that is the only way. Monsieur Bex has found it. On the other hand, I get some useful information about the Maison Clenel and the Hôtel de Brabançon. I carry that information to a very erudite gentleman in the palace of the Departmental Archives, and the next morning I know all about the severe Etienne de Grenelle and the joyous Madame de Brabançon. So when you and Betty Harlow are rehearsing in the Val d'Arzon, Nicolas Moreau and I are very busy in the Hôtel de Brabançon, with the results which now are clear to you, and one of which I have not told you, for the pearl necklace was in the drawer of the writing table. Jim Frobisher took a turn across the terrace. Yes, the story was clear to him now, a story of dark passions and vanity and greed of power with cruelties for its methods. Was there no spark of hope and cheer in all this desolation? He turned abruptly upon Hanaud. He wished to know the last hidden detail. "You said that you had made the inexcusable mistake. What was it?" "I bade you read my estimate of Anne Upcott on the façade of the Church of Notre Dame." "And I did," cried Jim Frobisher. He was still looking towards the Maison Clenel, and his arm swept to the left of the house. His fingers pointed at the Renaissance church with its cupolas and its loggia, to which Betty Harlow had driven him. "There it is, and under its porch is that terrible relief of the Last Judgment." "Yes," said Hanaud quietly, "but that is the Church of Saint-Michel, monsieur." He turned Frobisher about. Between him and Mont Blanc, close at his feet, rose the slender apse of a Gothic church, delicate in its structure like a jewel. "That is the Church of Notre Dame. Let us go down and look at the façade." Hanaud led Frobisher to the wonderful church and pointed to the frieze. There Frobisher saw such images of devils, half beast, half human, such grinning hogmen, such tortured creatures with heads twisted round so that they looked backwards, such old and drunken and vicious horrors as imagination could hardly conceive, and amongst them one girl praying, her sweet face tormented, her hands tightly clasped, an image of terror and faith, a prisoner amongst all these monsters, imploring the passers-by for their pity and their help. "That, Monsieur Frobisher, is what I sent you out to see," said Hanaud gravely, "but you did not see it." His face changed as he spoke. It shone with kindness. He lifted his hat. Jim Frobisher, with his eyes fixed in wonder upon that frieze, heard Anne Upcott's voice behind him. "And how do you interpret that strange work, Monsieur Hanaud?" She stopped beside the two men. "That, mademoiselle, I shall leave Monsieur Frobisher to explain to you." Both Anne Upcott and Jim Frobisher turned hurriedly towards Hanaud, but already he was gone. End of chapter 26. End of The House of the Arrow by A.E.W. Mason.